Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I've been debating about whether to post this or not, but I've finally decided that it's been long enough for me to talk about this. This happened to me and my mom a few months ago, back in October. It happened in a very rural part of New Hampshire, like a side road on a side road type of neighborhood. It was pouring out, as it had been raining for pretty much the whole day. My mom had just gotten back from down the street in my sister's car, and I was on the couch in the living room when suddenly I heard the doorbell ring. Our front door has a big glass pane in the front, so we can look out from the inside, and someone can look in from the outside. Through this window pane, I see a man. I didn't get a great look at him, as I didn't have my long distance glasses on. The man noticed that I had seen him and waved as if trying to be friendly. For the rest of this post, I'll refer to him as Jack. I got up and thought about opening the door for Jack, but relented as I couldn't properly see who it was. I didn't want to let a stranger into the house. Instead, I went down the hall to my parents' bedroom where my mom was getting ready for work. She asked what was up, and I explained to her that a man in a poncho was outside of her door and wanted to talk to us. She went as white as a ghost. Immediately, she stopped getting ready, closed and locked the bedroom door, and started checking the windows to make sure they were locked. I asked her what was going on. My mom explained that as she was driving home, she had seen this Jack guy. He had been standing, motionless, on the side of the main street. As soon as my mom turned down our road, he started to walk, presumably to follow her. She said the encounter was weird but thought nothing more of it. Why would someone be out in the pouring rain, down a back road in the afternoon? It was like he was waiting for something. I started to panic as well. My mom called my aunt. The two were like best friends and asked what she should do. My aunt told her to call the police immediately, and so we did. We proceeded to pace around the bedroom, frantically looking out the windows to see if we could see this Jack guy. From where the bedroom was angled, it was impossible to look at the front porch and see if he was still there, but we were desperate for anything. After what felt like hours, we finally saw a police car pull up. They carefully unlocked the door and went down to let the officer in. We explained what we saw, and he agreed to do a scan around the neighborhood. As he left, I noticed there was something on the doorknob. I took it off, and it was a political advertisement for a candidate that was running for office. It's possible Jack was just campaigning for the candidate, but there are a lot of holes in that story. It was pouring out, so why would you go door to door? And why would you go that route in such a rural neighborhood? The houses are so far apart, you barely make a dent on foot. The time doesn't make sense either. Sure, I and my mom were home, but it was about 4 in the afternoon. Most people would still be at work, so you'd probably get no response from knocking anyway. Eventually, the officer returned. He had found the guy down the road and had questioned him. This Jack guy was able to ID himself, and he claimed that he was a political campaigner and was just knocking on doors for that reason. When probed further, conveniently enough, Jack couldn't provide any other door signs, as the one he had left on our house was the last one. That makes the campaign story even more absurd. Our house is in the middle of the street. It's not like we were the last by any means, so why wouldn't you bring enough for the whole street? Even the officer pointed this out to us and said that it was unusual behavior. Although the officer was suspicious of him, there wasn't anything he could do about it, as there was no way to prove intent. He told us to be alert and do not hesitate to call if the man returns. Fast forward a few weeks, and I start noticing that a police car seems to be permanently stationed down the road from us, about a 3-minute drive. I got curious and asked my mom about it, and she said that there were multiple break-ins into the houses down the road, and the police were doing a sort of sting operation. The Jack man encounter and the break-ins may be unrelated, but considering how Jack acted, I have a sinking feeling that they are connected. I'll start this by saying I am a 29-year-old female from a small town in northern Tennessee, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and the kind where you have to drive 30 minutes to an hour to a job that pays a living wage. So when my dad started his new job around 9 years ago, he found out he was working at the same place as a friend he knew growing up, Barry. I'll also tell you that I was bullied a lot growing up, so I took compliments as jokes mostly. So when I first met Barry, he would compliment me and tell me how pretty I was. I was 20 at this time, and I always thanked him for the kind words. As time went on, the compliments got more intense. He would say he'd love to be with a woman my size. I always laughed it off and never said anything. This went on at company picnics and holiday parties I went to with my dad for about 4 years. Then I got a job with the same company, in the same department as Barry. Things were okay for the 3 months months he trained me. He still complimented me daily and I thanked him for the compliments. After my training, I went to night shift and only saw him for the 30 minutes of overlap per shift. Then 7 months into the job, my boyfriend and I broke up. Barry was sympathetic at first, then became a different person. His compliments became more focused on my body and not my face. He would stare at certain body parts while speaking to me and cock his head to the side while standing behind me if I bent down to pick something up. When I became single, he would also ask me about my preferences in the bedroom, if I be with a man of his age, which was early 50s, or a man of his size, 5'11" and 300 pounds. He'd become frustrated when I told him no. Declining everything he asked me never stopped him. He just upped his game. He'd start talking about me and my body to other people at work and asking them questions about me or trying to get them to ask me the questions he wanted answers to. He did this numerous times to my best friend, who will call Jay for privacy reasons. Well, luckily for me, Jay just so happened to have a massive crush on me. He'd never do anything Barry asked of him, and he always told me everything Barry said or asked. This continued on for around 8 months, and then Barry came to night shift, so my 30 minutes with him became 8 hours. He would start telling me all about his relationship history, unprompted. The questions, comments, and staring never stopped. To give you a small example, this man asked me if he won the lottery would I sleep with him for money. I said no. He offered me $1,000 one time to screw with him and I said no. I told him there is no amount of money in the world to make me sleep with him. He got mad at that. He'd ask for nude pictures, which I said no to. He'd ask Jay to try to sleep with me and take pictures and videos. He also said no. This all led to me being constantly stressed out and always looking over my shoulder to see if he was staring at me when I had to bend over to pick up something or if I had to reach for something. I did that to try and make him stop staring, but it didn't matter, he still did. I stopped talking to him. I stopped being in his vicinity. But it continued. His comments were just to other people in the building, mainly Jay. They came to a breaking point one week when my supervisor told me that my department had to work one weekend alone, just Barry and myself on our shift. I begged him not to make me come in. I told him I would call out and take a point or whatever I had to. I told him how scared I was to be alone with that man. I told him no man should be alone in a building this size with a woman, period. He listened and canceled the overtime, and he made sure I was never alone with Barry without a third person around. I finally broke down and told upper staff about it all. That turned out to be a waste of time. It continued for 6 more months, but thankfully I was on medical leave for surgery for 2 of those months. Then in November of last year, the right person on my shift heard me crying and complaining to Jay about everything before going home one night, and they complained to upper staff on my behalf. They finally opened an investigation. They asked me a ton of questions and my answers filled up 2 notebook pages front and back of just the comments and questions from him over 3 years. They asked Jay a ton of questions and a few other people who worked around us, and 3 days later, he was finally let go for harassment. He threatened me the day they put him on suspension for the investigation, and he was banned from company property unless he wanted to be arrested. I filed a no contact order against him and haven't heard from him in over a year. Jay finally told me that Barry had admitted to him at one point shortly before he was let go that if he ever got me alone, he was going to assault me and do ungodly things to me and then just leave my body somewhere. So I am extremely grateful to my supervisor for not letting that happen to me. I had to type this out twice to get my thoughts in order. But the thing that bothers me a lot about all this, Barry had a daughter a year younger than me and she had nothing to do with him when I knew him. I can't help but wonder what abuse he possibly put her through growing up. It has been over a year since this all came to an end. I'm no longer scared at work. I'm not on edge or stressed out. But as long as Barry is living and breathing in my hometown, I will not live there. And he's made a lot of enemies in that small town because of this. That happens in small towns when your parents know everyone, including the sheriff. Oh, and about Jay, his massive crush paid off and we're now dating. I've never felt safer with anyone in my life. So Barry, the pervert who made my work life suck for 3 years, let's never meet again. And to any other girl or woman who is being harassed at work, don't be afraid to speak up. I promise you it's worth it to tell someone. Every day I walk home from school with my friend because she lives only a little bit away from me, so our routes line up. At the start of the school year, we noticed there was a man usually looking at us from his window while we walked home from school. Found it a little weird, but ultimately didn't think much of it. A few months ago, after the heat of summer died down a bit, he started sitting out on his porch when we were walking by. Usually he would just smile at us. Sometimes I smiled back, but I usually just ignored him. One day as I was walking by his house, he waved to me from where he was sitting. I stopped and waved back at him and told him him to have a nice afternoon as I walked past. It felt a little weird because he didn't reply, but eventually I forgot about the whole thing. Once when my mother was at work and I was alone at our house, I noticed him walking past my house several times through my window. I felt very creeped out and uncomfortable. I considered talking to my parents about it just in case, but I ultimately convinced myself he wasn't doing anything wrong, so it didn't really matter. Yesterday I walked home from school alone because I stayed behind with some other kids outside the school for a few hours since we had our club that day, and I didn't want to walk home just to have to come back fairly soon after. I had just bought myself a nice pair of wired headphones a few weeks with money I've been saving up for a long time since I don't have a job. I was playing them over one ear as I was walking home. On the way home there is a public lot with a stable on it that I like to cut through to get into my yard as quick as I can rather than walking around the property. Sometimes people like to hang around it to meet up, but there wasn't anyone on it that I could see. As I rounded a corner on the stable, someone grabbed the back of my shirt. From the way they were grabbing it, I could see part of their hand. I jerked forward and they grabbed the top part of my headphones. The wire was at the bottom part of my neck and it got stuck for a moment, and I remember feeling like if I couldn't get away, something very bad was going to happen. The wire eventually snapped and I took off running as fast as I could, screaming. They let go of my shirt and I hopped the half-length fence to our property and I ran as fast as I could out onto the sidewalk in front of my house because I was worried that I would take too long on the lock if they were following me. By the time I actually got to the sidewalk point, I was crying and I felt like I was going to collapse because I was so scared. When I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't see anyone, but I kept running until I reached my friend's house in case whoever was there was still around. When I got there, I was in tears and it took a bit to explain the situation because they couldn't understand me. I tried calling my mother, but she wouldn't pick up the phone. My friend's mom called the police and they came to check things out. There was nobody at the stables and they told me that it was most likely some kid trying to mess around, but they escorted me home to where my mother was waiting for me anyways. I didn't tell them about the old man because I was worried they would think I was crazy considering he hasn't technically done anything, but there's something in my mind that keeps telling me that it was him who grabbed me at the stables. When I was walking home from school today, I brought a screwdriver with me in case I needed to defend myself. I also had my friend with me. My mother offered to pick me up from school, but I was worried that if I had shown how the encounter had affected me, then it would make things worse. I also avoided the stables and my friend made sure I made it to the door. The guy on his porch wasn't there today and I'm still not fully sure if it's him or not. I feel terrible that my headphones broke, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if they didn't. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. To start, I am a woman in my early 20s and I work as a cashier at a grocery store. I talk to hundreds of people a week. I should have knew something was off when he first came through my line about 6 months ago, but my job is to be friendly to people, so I treated him like every other customer. He was obviously down on his luck, and when I asked the usual question of, "How's it going today?" he proceeded to tell me a whole sob story. His wife had apparently kicked him out of the house. In his words, apparently because she was having a psychotic breakdown. Should have been my first red flag. He was houseless, lonely, and hungry. I felt bad for him and attempted to sympathize. He was trying to buy a hot roasted chicken, but our government programs in this state don't cover hot food for some reason. So I did some cashier magic and changed it so his food stamps would cover the chicken and he'd have a hot meal that night. This was my first mistake. Although he was extremely grateful, this also was apparently a defining moment for him. Every Monday he proceeded to come through my line and buy a hot chicken. I genuinely thought I was just doing something nice for someone going through a hard time. He always ended up trapping me at my register with conversation. At first it was to complain about his ex's psychotic behavior. He called her a narcissist and crazy. I just listened because I had nowhere to go. I was at work after all. After a while he got over it and moved into a hostel of some sorts. He was somewhat more stable, but also obviously depressed. He always told me I cheered him up and he enjoyed talking with me. I told him that I did as well. Maybe that wasn't the right thing to say, but I really did at the time. He would also occasionally ask what my shift was / when I got off work, but I was too naive at the time to see the harm in the question. Eventually he was very excited to tell me he got a hold of a used keyboard and was excited to be playing and writing music again. I told him that was awesome and that I also played the piano. Something must have clicked in his brain because now he had something to relate to me about. Every conversation we had from there on, he was encouraging me to play piano again and telling me I'd be a great music teacher, even though he'd never heard or seen me play. I nodded and smiled and did my job. I really thought the conversation topic was innocent enough. Then, one day, he asked for my email. This is where I feel I really screwed up. Even though it was a burner email and never planned on responding, I gave it to him. He was sending me music he liked and music he wrote, and I never responded to him. I knew it was upsetting to him, but at this point something felt weird and responding would have been opening another line of communication communication with him. I kind of had my fill at work already. At some point he also asked for my number, but I declined giving to him. He said he finally wanted to have a real conversation with me, even after never responding to his emails once. I should mention, my coworkers always thought the interactions he had with me were a little too personal and lengthy. Someone even called him a creep one day, but I brushed it off. I was just being friendly to someone who was down on their luck, so I thought. Eventually everything my coworkers were saying was starting to ring loudly in my head. I found myself avoiding him. He was sending me emails at least once a week and I never replied. I knew he'd come in on Mondays at about what time, so I'd take an extra break then. I just didn't want to see him anymore. I didn't want to talk, and to be frank, he was creeping me out a bit. Last week, one of the busiest weeks at the grocery store, the week before Thanksgiving, I couldn't avoid him and he came through my line. He only bought a bag of chips, very clearly just wanting to talk to me, and waited in line for 5 minutes instead of going through the express registers. I gave him short answers and tried not to engage too much. He told me I had saved his life and had somehow helped completely turn it around by being his cashier at the grocery store. This is something he has said before, but this time he told me he had wrote me a song to return the favor. I didn't know how to react, but in the moment I said I'd let him know what I think. I saw it in my email, but never gave a listen, never even read the email. This interaction made me feel weird. It told me everything I needed to know. He was thinking of me after he left the store. He was thinking of me while he was home. He was thinking about me while writing music. The only thoughts I were having about him were on Mondays, because I knew he'd be coming in. My thoughts about him were filled with dread and anxiety. Today was my absolute breaking point. I got back from my last break and saw him just getting off the bus. At this point, my coworkers know I tried to avoid him. I ran up the stairs to the break room and was obviously panicking. 15 minutes later, one of my coworkers comes in and lets me know he did 3 laps around the store looking for me and then left without buying anything. He was clearly seeking me out. I told her I was gonna wait 10 more minutes and would be back on the floor. So I did that, but when I got back to the floor, I was just filled with anxiety and clearly looking around for him. Thank God my coworkers had my back, because I didn't notice him coming in again, but he suddenly went straight to my register. I started having a panic attack. One of the other cashiers was very inviting to him. "I can help you right over here," she said. At this point, I was running away from the registers and the other cashier had stepped into where I was at. He ignored her and followed me. I didn't say anything. I was also clearly panicking and running away. He followed me to the steps yelling, "Wait, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I had just made it to the break room and the store manager opened the door. I had just had a conversation with him about this guy. He told me he would handle the next time he was in, to tell him he needs to leave me alone. I didn't realize it would be in the same day. I blurted out he's back. He was following me. Management ran down the stairs to try to catch him, but he was gone. He still didn't buy anything because he only does if I'm his cashier. I had a full-blown panic attack in the break room. I was crying. I called my boyfriend to come pick me up. I didn't want to be alone. His apologies rang in my ears. One of my coworkers pointed out he wouldn't be apologizing if he knew he wasn't doing something wrong. That really stung. She was 100% right. My coworkers comforted me. They told me it wasn't my fault and I don't need to be sorry. I just can't help but feel so sorry. Sorry I didn't have the guts to set boundaries with him sooner or tell him how uncomfortable he was making me. The store manager said his behavior was completely inappropriate, coming once a week when he knew I was working and only buying something if I was his cashier. He said that was stalker behavior. Everyone did. I ended up going home early and calling out for the next day. This was a few years ago. It was pretty late, past 2 in the morning. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we had gotten home, he tossed me out onto our front porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside. I was still wearing what I had worn to the party and it was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet in the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned off the lights both inside and outside of the house, I knew he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, even though he didn't have many, but I had anxiety about waking any of them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So instead I decided I would try to walk to this gas station and motel, which was like a little less than a mile away, so I could use their phone to try to call a girlfriend of mine to see if I could sleep over with her. A little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road that I was on. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and beginning to make a U-turn and my heart just started pounding. I just about froze up but forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up to me and this guy rolled down his window and asked what I was doing out this late. I told him how I was going to meet my friend at the gas station and that she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike. He told me, well good. I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker though, you just look like you need some help. He just kept driving next to me and told me I shouldn't think he was a creep, and he pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me he had just gotten off duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I get to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and quote-unquote credentials, and when he offered me a ride again I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far away anyway. He popped the door open for me and I hopped in. The radio was low. It was a little messy, the ashtray was full of cigarettes, there were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor. As I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight colored bandana, and some other things. He apologized, saying that it was the truck he took hunting, but it was super warm so I was happy and didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John. He asked why I was scantily dressed without a jacket, and I started to tell him about the party and the fight I had been in with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest him. I asked about him and he told me about his family. He was a young dad. He had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog, and I told him it was like he had the perfect little family, and he laughed and said he certainly did. Then it had sort of clicked for me to ask him I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. We were approaching the gas station and he drove right past it. I politely said, oh, I think that's the one, but he didn't answer me. I felt sick to my stomach. My heart started pounding. I started getting choked up. My eyes started tearing up as I was looking out the windows and watching the lights behind us getting further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around, and he ignored me. Whenever I would look at him, he just looked empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed. I looked back out the window and down at the road to see if maybe we were going slow enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remember always hearing never go to the second location, but I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be a lot harder to get away with one foot as opposed to two, debating with myself that there was snow on the ground, but then again, snow is hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I feel so dumb now too because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared though, like there was nothing but trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point and asked if I could please borrow his phone again. I honestly don't know why I even asked, and he told me to stop talking. Then he started talking underneath his breath, saying, girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't have been alone this late. Look what you're doing to me. Dressed like this, and other derogatory things. As he kept saying these terrible things, too many to type out here to be honest. I wasn't even responding. I was just crying and trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I remembered the pair of handcuffs I remember seeing under the papers beneath my feet, so I used that little I don't know how to describe it, like scoopy motion. I managed to use my feet to scoop the handcuffs up and use my heels and toes to push them under the bottom of my seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different things I could do to try to help myself, like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, if I ever made it to them, I could just grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them, or maybe how if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could grab the wheel and swerve so he would appear to be a drunk driver and we'd get pulled over. I guiltily thought about the possibility if this man is just having a weird night and how if I did anything it would hurt him, but I told myself that sort of thinking sort of got me into this mess. He pulled off road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side the wooded trees were closer to the road. On mine, then there was a small gap fully covered in thick snow, before the trees thickly picked up maybe 10 yards away. He turned off the car and coldly said there was something wrong with the car and to get out with him. As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed onto the center console and cried and pleaded not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the trunk bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console, thinking my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, please John, I'm so cold and scared. I was thinking of everything I ever heard. Humanize yourself, use first names. He stared at me in this like way I can't even describe it to this day. I don't even know how to start. He got back in the car and I slinked towards my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the headlights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting a cigarette and looking out his window and back at me and then back out his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs, but while still staring out his window told me if I thought about running. He had a quick way to get me where he wanted me, and oddly enough I was sort of thinking of running minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car then I should definitely stay in, otherwise he could chase me or shoot me. I think at that point I sort of hit some sort of bottom of my reserve, and instead of panic, there was numbness and exhaustion. It was dead quiet, but I finally just barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me and asked about his wife and children, and he flatly said he didn't have a wife or children and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about and he said, "I'm thinking of what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, he just said it flatly and coldly, which sort of scared me more. I did start getting worked back up to a cry at that point, and he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I just cried and said I wanted to go home. Eventually, he started driving and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach for the wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down. While pulling up, he told me not to tell anyone or he would find me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. He was almost coming to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changes his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I was already down out of the truck and sprinting towards the gas station. The panic was overwhelming me, but then I stopped and remembered to try to see his license plate. I turned around but only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police. I waited until the officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little scared it would be John. My fears melted away when the new-faced policeman got there. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I had caught, the fact he said he was an off-duty cop, just basically anything I could. I asked him if he could look at the camera, and the officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, then came back out saying there was nothing was on them. I asked if I would be able to look, and the officer said no and asked me if I didn't trust him, and I told him of course I did. The officer gave me a ride to my friends, lecturing me for hitchhiking. I never heard anything back about the report that was made, so I would try to follow up, and each time I did, they never got back to me aside from this one time I was told my case number didn't exist. But that didn't stop me from trying to follow up. Throughout the months and years, I asked my friend, whose home I slept over at that one night, if she ever heard of any weirdness or anything since that incident had happened to her or anyone up there, and she always says no. So I sort of let it go and try to tell myself that maybe he actually was just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhiked again, so if it was a lesson, it certainly worked. I never heard anything back having to do with the case. I never heard of any other odd experiences up there. Maybe it was just one man trying to teach me something. But honestly, sometimes I think I tell myself all of that to help me sleep better at night. It all felt really real. Even if it wasn't real, I'm really glad I didn't get out of the car in the woods that night. This memory from a year ago popped into my head, and I want to share because I was so shocked in the moment. I realize now how scary the situation was, and it was just super strange. I, a 22-year-old woman, met my dad at a tire shop in an increased crime area of town. Not really sure why we went to this shop. It was probably around noon. My dad brought his chihuahua with him, so I took her on a walk around the tire shop while he consulted with the mechanics. The shop was about half a football field away from a busy street, with a big field in between the shop and the street, and an otherwise residential area. I figured it was safe enough to walk the dog around in the field because my dad and the mechanics were right there. However, the shop was fenced in and not facing the field, so I guess it wasn't actually that safe for me because my dad/employees couldn't see me. So I was just walking the little dog around in this field, not too close to the busy street. And suddenly, this beat up car with the windows down starts driving really slowly on the busy street. And I can tell the dude driving was staring at me. The street is somewhat far away from me, and he eventually drives past, so I'm like, whatever. But then a couple seconds later, I see the car again going down the street in the opposite direction, going really fast, and he turns onto the side street where I am. He's driving very, very fast, and he just guns it into the field where I'm walking the dog, literally jumping the curb. He's coming straight for me, very fast, and I'm just shocked, thinking, is he about to plow us down? What is happening? It was just so quick and unexpected. In my confused shock, I'm just hesitating with the dog, contemplating running away but also not wanting to turn my back on the car. Then, miraculously, I guess there was some kind of uneven ground or a hole because the guy's car, which was a real beater, very old, got stuck and a wheel started spinning. With his windows down, I could hear him cursing and take this moment to scoop up the dog, about to run out of there. Then he opens the car door, about to get out of the car. I can't remember any descriptions about this man other than he was quite overweight. Again, because of the shock, I can't even recall his race or age range strange or anything. Right at that moment, a truck pulls up beside us with 2 young men inside. It was like a construction truck. They roll down the windows and ask if this guy is bothering me. They say it loudly and it spooks the guy, and he goes back into his car. He then is able to peel out and reverse from whatever hole the car was stuck in. He very quickly reverses out from the field we're in, back onto the street, and takes off. The kind men who stopped apparently saw all this happen. It just happened so quickly. They were just as confused as I was. What was this dude's game plan? What was he attempting? Kidnapping me in broad daylight, obviously with people around. I'm not sure. I'm so glad his car got stuck and I didn't find out. It was just very strange. I'm grateful his car got stuck and the guys who drove by stopped and were willing to check out the situation. We chatted for a second after the guy left and were all very confused about what had happened. I can be overconfident at times about my safety, but after a handful of other strange, potentially dangerous encounters, I've learned to always be alert. Bad things can happen anytime and anywhere, and don't freeze in fight or flight situations. So many times, I've frozen instead of fighting or flighting when I really should have taken some kind of action. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street 10 plus miles from a town, and there were 7 houses in the area spread out on a 2.5 acre wooded lots or larger each. There were no large wild animals. There are bears or similarly large animals in the region, and people didn't meander there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years I lived there, so please keep that in mind. When I was a young girl in my early teen years, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door, Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open the window and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second story window faced our backyard and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway. I'd often know if he was out. The light was out over the side door entrance or already home, light being off. One time during the summer when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of a car and was talking to his friends. Soon his friends pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond as he probably didn't hear me. Then I came up with the not so brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we'd often sneak around and scare each other, so I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door, which led to our backyard below my window, which led to Terry's house off the side through our gravel area, then through a well-worn path through the woods about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven steppy path in the gravel, and if you stepped off of the rounds, the crunch of gravel and rocks would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark and I didn't see him. Also at that time I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do to him. But I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods slow and pausing every once in a while like me. It was coming closer and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly to my window to talk. Therefore I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still startle him. I still thought it was Terry and he saw me sneak out and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening / checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered after losing patience one last time for Terry, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so I quietly tippy-toed back to my garage door and went back inside, silently locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I was just standing / crouching. My window was open and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window but got no answer. Then I heard someone or something fall and crack and mow pretty loudly in the window well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you aren't familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house, dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. well. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level and a hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. We had been playing hide and seek and many outdoor games for years since we were young around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells and house footprints, plus paths in the woods like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded humanish and not like an animal. It also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game and someone or something was out there and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out, so I couldn't lean my head out the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks as whatever it was stepping in the noisy gravel. Again, Terry would know where the log rounds were and would not step in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen 2 stories up for probably a half hour. I never heard it, him, or her leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. It wasn't Terry. I asked him later and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He also would have no reason to lie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors and I can't think of any reason a person would be there. We had few neighbors and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out in 2.5+ acres per home. There weren't any big animals in the area. As wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to homes. Plus our dog scared them away. So stranger in the woods, let's not ever meet. A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my hometown as a driver. I was 27, but made good money delivering. I had worked at a few other places, both local and chain, in the years before, and still work as a dasher on occasion even after this happened. Now I choose to deliver in much safer areas for this reason. I got luckier than I could ever imagine. One night I was working and had 2 deliveries to take. Both were cash orders. I had $12 left in my bank. It's what drivers are given to use as change for cash orders, so you don't have a ton of cash on you at all times. The first order went smoothly. The guy gave me $50 for a $35 order, so I was excited about the nice tip. I drove to the second delivery. It was an apartment complex with multiple buildings. I had delivered there before. The sun was about to set, but it was still very light out. The chain I worked at had us drive company cars with the logo on it, all white sedans. This is important for later. I grab the order and go to the door to the apartment building. A young guy comes out, and a much bigger older guy was outside smoking a cigarette. The big guy went inside as the smaller guy came out. He looked around nervously and asked how much he owed me. The way he was looking around just made me very nervous. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told him the amount and he said that wasn't what he was told on the phone. Something was very wrong. I felt someone else walk out behind me from the door as the first young guy looked around down the parking lot, craning his neck as if he was looking for someone. I told him the amount again and broke down the order for him, trying to keep calm. Then the first guy held a gun to my right temple. I also felt a poke on my spine. 2 gunmen. I couldn't speak. Words wouldn't form no matter how hard I tried. Give me your money and keys. No. The first guy growled and I fumbled immediately for the keys. I gave him my bank but hadn't realized the 50 was mixed in. I gave him the keys, trying my best to remain calm. Another guy came up from my left. He had poofy hair and was around the same age as the first kid. The one behind me I hadn't seen yet. The big hair kid grabbed the pizza bag and ran off and hid. The first kid searched the company car. Luckily I had left my wallet in my personal car. I saw him grab my cell phone and that's when the panic began to set in. I had pictures on that phone that I hadn't backed up of my then 5-year-old son, who absolutely is my world. Please don't take that. I have pictures of my son who died on there. It's all I have of him, please. I lied. My son is very much alive. The kid behind me spoke softly. Trust me, just listen to him. You'll get it back, I'm damaged. I don't want to be here either. I could tell he'd been crying by how his voice sounded. A car began pulling in and the 3 boys took off to the other end of the complex in a full sprint. Before the one behind me ran, he dropped the gun in front of me. I could tell the gun's safety was off. Looked completely real to me. He picked it back up and ran with the others. The car that pulled in saw me. It was a woman and her kid. Panic set in as I realized they could easily come back and do way worse to me as the sky started to get dark. I collapsed. They had taken my company car keys, $72, the pizza, and my phone. The woman ran up to me and asked if I was alright. She took me into her apartment in the next building over and locked the door. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hold her phone to talk to the police on the phone as she set down her kid. Her boyfriend, I assumed, helped me call. I spoke to the operator and told her everything. I'm colorblind and these guys were obviously wearing all black and white clothes, thank God. I had a full description of 2 of them. The poor woman who helped me was going to be late for work, but she still stayed until I was off the phone and cops had shown up. Man, she was harsh and blunt with the operator, but I will never forget this woman's utter kindness to me and her boyfriends. Cops showed up and contacted my store, and my manager brought out the spare keys for me to drive the car back to the store. After dealing with the cops, I drove back and was greeted by crying and beyond worried coworkers. All of them were terrified that I was hurt. It meant a lot to me how much they cared, but I told them I was fine. I filed the proper paperwork, and the 72 was written off as a loss to the store. Thank God, because I had worked other stores that make you pay back the money out of pocket if you get robbed to prevent drivers from stealing. I was told by the owner to take the rest of the night off and take care of myself. He gave me a hug. He was to this day one of the best bosses I ever had. What I didn't know was I was in for a very long night. I called my best friend before I left the store from the store phone and asked where he was. We usually meet up for drinks after work. He was around the corner at a bar, so I met up with him. His dad was a District 4 cop in my city at the time, the same district that this happened in. He told me his dad had given him a heads up and he had 2 shots waiting for me to calm my nerves. After the 2 shots, we began playing pool when his dad called his phone and asked if I was with him yet. He said yeah and handed me the phone. His dad asked if I could come to the station. I was honest and told him I'd had 2 shots, so he sent out a squad car to get me since it wasn't that far away. We get to the station. They had suspects in custody. I was needed to ID them. 3 boys and a driver. They had been caught less than 20 minutes after the robbery speeding. The bolo had already gone out and they matched the description. They had used the money to buy weed and gas and had taken off. They had at least 15 stolen cell phones on them. The order had been placed on a stolen phone. My phone was in the mix in the box. The police told me to grab my phone only, and I did. They asked me to unlock it. It had fingerprint verification, so that was easy. 9 of the 10 tries to unlock it had already been used before my phone would have completely reset. It unlocked. I told the police every detail yet again. Although my parental instincts kicked in, I told them the guy behind me quite obviously was bullied into this and to show mercy. He was the one with the white shirt. The police went wide-eyed and told me he was the one talking. The other 3 denied involvement. That's when I found out about the 4th guy, the driver. We found out later he was completely unaware of the robbery and was just picking up his friends. He was never charged. The boy who was behind me and the one who grabbed the pizza were 15 and 16 and got 6 months of house arrest. The only reason the one behind me got off easy despite having the gun to my back was because I asked them to go easy on him, that he was a good kid who didn't want to be there, and he was the only one confessing. Makes sense since he had even said the other guy wouldn't at the phone for long. He was planning on going to the cops had they not been caught. But the other guy, the first kid who put the gun to my temple, it was his 18th birthday. He got the book thrown at him. In the courtroom, he made fun of me and was laughing at me. Saying him made me panic. The judge scolded him for his behavior and he just grinned and glared at me with a Joker-like grin. All I could see was pure evil. This kid will commit more crimes. I have no doubt he will eventually end someone's life. You can see how cold he is just by looking in his eyes. He's evil incarnate. I grew up in a town full of murderers and abusers. I had never seen this kind of evil in my life, and I never want to see it again. I asked to have my name stricken from the records and asked to remain anonymous in case he ever got out. I'm so glad I did, because today I got a letter from the state. He's being released in February. The court only had my old address, which was my parents' house, and my mom didn't think the letter was important. I missed the deadline to protest his release for probation. The plea deal was 8 years. It's only been 4. He's getting out early due to overcrowding. Not good behavior, overcrowding. This coming February, and I'm ready if he finds me. My wife, my parents, everyone I know knows his face and name. If he tries anything, we are all ready. I have a new edit for this post. He's already got a warrant out for new crimes. I don't know the details, but I know there was another victim based on the type of crimes committed. 3 of them. He got let out February 2nd. The warrants are from February 22nd. I've been watching his Facebook since everything was public, just making sure he was staying away from my family. I hadn't checked it since the middle of February, so I just checked it. I noticed he stopped posting. Since he was posting everything including asking for smoke and when he was going to be on Facebook, that was unusual, so I checked the records page. More violent crimes have been committed and he's more than likely on the run. From his Facebook, it looked like he was turning around. Guess not. I feel horrible. I know I tried my hardest to make sure he stayed in. Victim services did not care to listen basically. Now he's hurt someone else. I feel horrible for the new victim, and I know it's not, but I can't help but feel like I'm partially guilty for this. I'll keep updating as this develops. As of right now, he's on the run. Another edit March 22nd, 2023. He is back in prison as of March 8th for 5 charges. If victim services has ever failed, it's now. I can't help but feel guilty and horrible, like I could have done more. He is being charged with violent crimes against individuals, possession of a weapon under disability, so probation violation I guess, and homicide. Someone died by his hand. After I fought as much as I could to try to keep him locked up. I know this isn't my fault, yet I can't stop the guilt. killed. Hopefully this won't happen to anyone else by his hand, as at this point it'll be years before we get a verdict more than likely, so this may be the final update. Thank you all so much for your support. Stay safe out there, friends. It's a crazy world. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. Autumn of 2019 in British Columbia, Canada. I am from Germany, but spent half a year in Canada as part of my bachelor's degree. I barely got back before the pandemic hit. I was 22 years old at the time, and the other people involved were about the same age. Another foreign student, and I befriended this local Canadian student. We all had the same interests in humor, and the dude became a very good friend of ours. He told us all about the local area, and we spent a week in the summer with him and his father at their very remote, remember this is important, cabin near some woods. They taught us how to handle guns there and let us shoot a lot. Then fall came and we had a lot of free time due to being finished with all our papers. So our buddy proposed that we spend a few days at his dad's cabin, this time without his father. We went heck yeah because we could load up on booze and weed and have a great time there. Just living the life. 3 close dudes in the woods gaming and getting wasted. Sounds great, right? After loading up on all the quote-unquote supplies, the first 3 days were very calm. In this case, what freaked me out the most was the fact that we were far away from civilization, and you never understand how quiet your surroundings can be until you spent some time in a remote area like this, which led to me often just standing in the dark at night, listening to the surroundings of the cabin. But after the first few days I got less paranoid. After all, I was with friends, was constantly high, and we were quite armed and dangerous, probably more dangerous to ourselves to be honest. Day 4 came. We spent the day attempting to hunt in the woods, mostly just chilling under trees with a beer and rifle in hand. But in the evening it started to rain heavily. After an hour we were starting to see lightning in the distance, with quite a bit of time passing between lightning and thunder, which meant the thunderstorm itself was still some time away. So we aborted our incompetent hunting attempts and started trekking back to the cabin. It took us about an hour to reach it, due to it already being very dark and the rain creating unsafe footing. For context, you should know that once you spent a few days in the wilderness and haven't seen a soul other than your friends for days, you can become quite careless about your surroundings. I think you can imagine why I am telling you that last part. So we entered the cabin. At that time the thunderstorm was raging full on, and we put away our gear and changed clothes, except for our guns. Yes, I know, drugs and guns are a horrible combination and I wouldn't mix that stuff nowadays, but we were drilled quite well by Canadian friends' dad regarding trigger discipline, safety, that type of stuff. And man, I really miss spooning a rifle while sleeping. We cozied down in the living room at a table, started a YouTube video, and began playing cards. Barely 20 minutes passed since we returned, and at the time, we didn't bother closing the curtains in the living room because thunderstorms are cool. So imagine that we were 3 guys sitting around a table, occasionally in awe at the weather outside while playing cards. In such a remote place, it is extremely dark outside. Without a full moon and clear skies, it is pitch black. The only lamps we have are old vintage looking and dimmer than my phone's screen. What comes next is how my also non-local friend has described what he saw. While sipping from his beer, another lightning went off. He spit it out instantly after the lightning came and screamed loudly and stood up. No words, just the sound of panic. My Canadian friend and I were instantly perplexed and looked at him. There is somebody outside. He started rambling about how in that split second the lightning illuminated the outside of the cabin. He saw a person standing a bit of distance away from the cabin, looking directly at us. My non-local friend is obviously in full-on panic. His face looks anxious. This communicated to our Canadian buddy and me that this guy wasn't just messing with us. He did see somebody outside. I grabbed my rifle and pulled the bolter rack around into the chamber. I feel that warm sensation running down my spine of my body, releasing adrenaline. I tried to stay far away from the window, stare into the darkness outside, but I can't see anything. While our Canadian friend rushed into his room to grab his pistol, I start panicking even more because I realized we didn't lock the door. Why would we? We haven't seen anyone in days and are in the middle of wilderness. So I run to the door and lock it. Our friend returns with his pistol, which he grabbed because there was a flashlight attached to it. He carefully approached the window, then changed his pace from sneaky to fast and pushed the window open with one hand, while the other hand was aiming the handgun outside. I wish I was any good at drawing, because what we saw next when our friend turned on the flashlight was the most terrifying image I have ever seen. It is burned into my mind. The fact that I cannot share that image with other people has been bugging me for 3 years now. The light turns on and what we saw in that moment was a man, tall and slim, dressed in all black, with a hooded raincoat which he has pulled over his head, almost covering his eyes, but not far away from the cabin, just a few steps away from the window, not standing as our friend yelled earlier clear, but crouching, looking directly at us with clenched eyes and a terrifying little smirk on one side of his mouth. Another lightning flashes, and for that moment we were all frozen. The image of what we saw must have shocked the other guys as much as it did me, because nobody said anything for a few seconds. There is a hard to explain dreadful feeling about seeing something like this. In a storm, in the middle of nowhere, a person dressed in a black raincoat is suddenly crouching so close to you. I'm facing you. Our Canadian buddy was aiming his pistol and attached flashlight at the also frozen crouched smirky man and just yelled out, with a slight stutter and a higher pitched voice than I've ever heard from him, "Get away from us or we will shoot." I guess at that moment, after his eyes adjusted, the raincoat man realized that this was not just a flashlight, but a gun, and I was standing next to my friend with a hunting rifle in my arm. Raincoat man's slight smirk changed to something where I am unsure if it was shock or rage. All this was happening in less than a minute, while my friend kept on yelling, and I was just frozen. The raincoat man figure turned by about 90 degrees towards the nearest tree line. A wave from crouch to full sprint quickly. He ran away to the right side of our window. Two of us poked their head out of the window to see where exactly he was going, but with the heavy rainfall and darkness we could barely make out anything in the distance of that tree line. After a few minutes of just looking at each other in disbelief, we decided to pop off a few rounds outside the window to prove that we were for real and to cope. When the shock wore off, we decided to call the police. They asked a lot of questions on the phone to describe the location of the cabin and a description of the man who just almost crept up on us, totally unsuspecting and only revealed due to lightning and luck. Due to us being in such a remote area, the cops told us it'd take at least 1 or 2 hours for somebody to come out. They asked, because of the weather and time, if it'd be alright if they sent somebody out tomorrow to talk to us about all the details. Given how the man saw that we were armed, he probably wouldn't come back again. They agreed. We discussed just jumping in the truck and leaving right now, but us idiots were too lazy to refuel the truck. The idea of doing this now, in the dark and in that heavy rain, was just too frightening. I kept thinking about this guy lurking in the darkness and picking us off one by one. We spent the night sleeping in shifts. One person was awake and standing guard. The others at least attempted to sleep. When my turn came, the rain had died down. I turned off all the lights, opened a window, and just sat there in the darkness, trying to listen for any sound I could hear and looking out of the windows to scan the area. Let me tell you, when you're sitting in the dark for hours in full alert mode, just try and sit still, listen, and look around, you have a lot of time to think and reiterate what just happened. Close to the middle of the next day, 2 cops arrived. We had to give them a detailed report of what happened, when it happened, and had to show them in which direction the raincoat man ran off to. They said they will organize for a patrol to comb through the woods, but that might take a while because they need experienced outdoorsmen. Sadly, we didn't see many details of the man's face. We couldn't tell if he was young or old, only that he was tall and clean shaven. The chances of finding who exactly that was, and find out what the heck he was attempting to do, were very small, though one of the officers expressed that this whole happening was deeply worrying. We left the cabin a few hours after the police left, and Canadian guy's dad insisted we stay at his place at least for a day until we feel safe again. He also wanted to hear every last detail and figured that the time has come to install cameras around the cabin. I don't remember this part for sure, but I believe that I heard later the dad and his brother went back to the cabin and just sat there in the dark, waiting for the raincoat man to return. But I never heard of any results, so I guess he must have gone hunting in other areas. I never heard from them cops again. Next January, I left Canada and returned home. My Canadian friend was called in for an interview a few months later, and it seemed like the police were still seriously investigating this, looking for the guy who crept up on a cabin during a thunderstorm. We have speculated a lot about what that was. The winning theory is that this guy most certainly had sinister intentions. This did not look like just an attempt at burglary. Remember, we had dim lights on. You could see that there was somebody inside the cabin. This guy was creeping towards us in a raincoat during a thunderstorm. When my friend yelled out that he saw somebody, this guy went from walking / standing to crouching, and he went closer towards the window. I suspect the raincoat man wanted to check what kind of victim was on the menu, and I don't really want to imagine what he had in store if there were 2 unarmed girls there and a cabin in the middle of nowhere. We didn't see any headlights passing the clearing the cabin was on. The guy also had no backpack or something, just a raincoat and black weather appropriate clothing. I bet my soul that this guy was a man on a mission who knew exactly what he was doing and what he was well prepared for. While writing this post, I also started thinking about the logistics of it all. The guy must have a camp or at least a car hidden somewhere in those woods. You can't sustain yourself out there otherwise. I also got the feeling that he either came upon the cabin during the storm itself, or that he spotted us in the woods during the hunting we did before. We moved slowly, while also not being shy with waving our lights around. And in total pitch darkness wilderness, a proper flashlight must have been as easy to spot as beacons, so he might have tracked us through the woods until we reached the cabin. Hello everyone, I wanted to share my scary encounter that occurred just yesterday on the bus. So for a bit of context, I am a college student. Without giving too many details, I am a woman on the smaller side of average female height. I currently do not have a car, so I use my bike, walking, and the bus to get around. My college has a transit service that allows you to scan in with a student boarding pass for free. Other non-students are allowed to ride the bus by paying upon entry or purchasing a ticket beforehand. I frequently ride the bus for various reasons, grocery runs or treating myself to food, and yesterday I had the idea of treating myself to a movie after all the exams I have been having lately. I'm an avid horror fan and knew that Terrifier 2 was in theaters, so of course I wanted to see it immediately. One of my friends told me they found it funny and really enjoyed it, which was more than enough reason to go see it. I was looking at tickets the day before yesterday and trying to decide which time slot I wanted to see the movie in. Looking back now, something in my gut told me to choose the earlier time. I wish I had listened. Another detail I want to add is that there are two bus sizes, a large one and a small one. The bus I rode during the incident was the smaller one. The stop where I got on the bus is the beginning of the route. Unlike every other stop, the driver usually parks the bus here for 5 minutes and gets off to use the restroom or have a quick break before continuing with the rest of the route. Upon entering the bus, I noticed only two other passengers, another girl about my age and an older man. The girl was in the front of the bus on the right side and the man was in the second row on the left side. I sat on the right side several rows back. I usually read something on my phone or listen to music on the bus, so I immediately got on my phone when I sat down. Everything was okay for a little bit until I looked up and noticed the man repeatedly staring at me and looking away before staring at me again. I was immediately apprehensive but just brushed it off. He started speaking aloud out of nowhere, saying things like, "Beautiful baby and so fine," while staring at me. I was frozen out of fear and could only keep looking at my phone and trying to ignore it. This continued until I worked up the courage to say, "Sir, would you please stop staring at me?" To which he claimed he was not staring and told me I was extremely beautiful. Unsure of what to say, I just stupidly thanked him and went back to my phone. He had his body slightly turned, but when I confronted him, he faced fully forward. The driver got back on and we started moving again, so everything was calm for a bit, though I was admittedly still shaken up. This calm did not last long. Obviously, this creep couldn't contain himself and just had to voice his opinions about me out loud. He started saying similar things again, but also added some new phrases such as, "Going to make you my wife," and by far the worst one, "I'm gonna get you pregnant." I was shaking at this point and was unsure what to do. I desperately wanted to sit next to the other girl but did not want to pass by him to sit by her. We made it to 2 other stops before the girl got off and said sorry before leaving. My heart dropped to my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to be alone with this guy. Luckily, more people got on at this stop, a middle-aged couple and a guy about my age. In a panicked voice, I sort of shouted and asked the guy my age if he would sit with me. He was a bit confused but came to sit by me and I immediately felt relief. The stress of the situation got to me and I broke down crying. I guess the creep took this as indication to leave because he swiftly made his exit after that. The kind younger guy who sat next to me and began to comfort me. I am so grateful he chose to ride the bus that day. The bus driver noticed the commotion and called me to the front to get information in order to make a report. He told me he couldn't hear anything but that buses have video and would hopefully pick up what the creep was saying. He told me that same man had recently been kicked off for a similar incident and that he would be reporting this immediately. For the rest of the ride, the younger guy and I talked about things like majors and other school related stuff. I want to go into the marine biology field and he is a graduate student in mechanical engineering. I made it to the movies, it was awesome, and back home safely, but I definitely learned a lesson. My boyfriend is going to help me look into some self-defense items and he taught me a few fighting tactics. 2 years ago, I moved to the United Kingdom for university, as I always wanted to go there and get away from my parents as the situation at home was beginning to become too toxic for me. In first year at university, I moved into a student accommodation and met some really great people. It was a good year, without meeting my boyfriend, who I'm still with, and just enjoying my time away from my family and discovering what independence really meant. Anyhow, as second year came by, I decided with some friends to move into a house rented by student accommodations, but at least we have our own house and weren't restricted as much with noise and parties as living in a small shared flat like in first year. To note, I had a ground floor room and my window gave into a very small backyard in which I would go smoke every day as I am a smoker, and in which there would be a very thin wooden door giving into the other side of the street where you would put your bins and broken chairs and stuff. The door could only be closed and locked from inside the backyard, but since it was an old door we had to attach some strings to keep it closed for good. I had neighbors on each side of the house, so we were surrounded by families and some other student accommodations. The neighbors on the right of of us were 5 boys who looked way over the age of being in university. They were strange, so to say. I met one of them outside of our house one day because of a police intervention due to one of his flatmates attacking him and the others with a kitchen knife and burning their kitchen down. I heard some screams, and so I went outside with my flatmates and saw one of them being covered in blood and cuts everywhere on his arm and a wound on his head inflicted by a kitchen knife. Me and my flatmates didn't know what to do, so we offered him our help to clean himself and gave him an old shirt to change out of his bloody clothes. We then saw the guy who hurt these flatmates being escorted out by the police and into a van and driven off to be arrested. I don't know anything more about the story. The police didn't really tell us anything else. Anyway, the guy who we helped was quite weird. He said a lot of lies and kept trying to grab me and flirt with me, and we noticed when helping him he smoked quite a lot of weed, but just didn't really care at the moment, as we just wanted to make sure he was okay as we didn't know him. Then after some time had passed, I would go to university and come back home and see him quite often in the street, and just never said a word to him again. But one day, he came up to me in the street while I went to the corner shop and started talking to me weirdly, and I didn't feel comfortable at all with that for some reason, so I just didn't respond to him. He then just said, "Oh, that's okay, I'll just wait in front of your house then, and we can talk further." No need to say I was creeped out, and just thought he was joking, so I bought my drink at the shop and headed back to my street, and as I turned into the street where my house was, I saw him with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep and waiting for me. So I panicked and went back next to the corner shop and called my only guy flatmate to ask him to open the door and tell the guys to go away. But obviously he wasn't home and no one else was either, so I literally just waited it out until they left 1 hour later and then sprinted back home and locked the front door. To also note, my front door had a glass panel on it where you would be able to kind of make out who was standing in front of it. After this already pretty scary encounter, I just tried to avoid the guy and mostly succeeded for a while. But then one day, as I went smoking in the backyard, I noticed that the wooden door, which is always closed, was open, and the strings that we put there to keep it closed were cut off. For whatever reason, I didn't think anything of it and just closed the door again and put a new string on it, thinking it was one of my flatmates who took the bins out and just didn't tie it back. The weird neighbors would very often scream and yell and fight in their house, and it would wake me and my flatmates up in the middle of the night, but we kind of got used to it after a while. But one evening, my boyfriend slept over like he usually did, and he, who usually never ever wakes up because of a noise, woke up in the middle of the night because of a bang and some whispering. I was sound asleep, so he very silently woke me up, and we both just waited in the dark and listened for any other noises. Suddenly, we heard the wooden door just bang, just shot open, and some footsteps next to my window. I always had my window open because it would get really warm inside, so we both just froze. And then we heard the door leading to the backyard get shaken softly as if they were trying to get inside, and then they stopped. Luckily, we had the curtains closed, so they couldn't see us, but we were ready to get dressed and get out of the room and lock them in if they came in from the window. Then we just heard my window move and get more open, and one of the guys saying something in a different language that we didn't understand, and started to hear them trying to get in. My boyfriend and I just shot up out of the bed, took my phone, and put clothes on and ran out of the room and out of the house. So I then called my flatmates and told them to lock themselves in their rooms, and then the police, who luckily came in less than 5 minutes as the headquarters were a couple of streets down from us. I don't remember anything after the police came. I think me and my boyfriend were in shock. They ended up catching one guy, the other fled and was later found a few streets up smoking weed. The police told us they went inside of their house and found a lot of meth and heroin, and they were carrying a massive kitchen knife with them. I was so confused as I've never done anything to offend or do anything wrong to my neighbors, so the idea of them breaking in with God knows what intentions with a kitchen knife terrorized me and my boyfriend. The 2 guys ended up being arrested, and one of them was put in prison for 2 years for carrying a weapon with intention to harm. I never heard anything else from the police, and I moved back home a few months later as I was so scared, and it tormented me for months on end not knowing what would have happened if my boyfriend didn't wake up. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. I grew up in a suburb of a medium-sized city. Behind my house was a sprawling forest reserve, and winding through it was a network of trails. I had roamed these trails since childhood, and by the time I was a teenager, I knew the twists and turns like the back of my hand. During the summer before college, I had made it a routine to jog these trails in the evenings. The thick canopies, chirping birds, and that earthy smell made the experience therapeutic. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, I laced up my sneakers and headed out. About 20 minutes into my jog, I reached a clearing that overlooked a creek. I often paused here to take in the view, but that day, something was off. I saw a man standing on the other side of the creek. He was middle-aged, wearing a tattered brown jacket despite the summer heat, and he was staring straight at me. I offered a tentative wave, thinking maybe he was lost, but he didn't wave back. Instead, his stare intensified. Unsettled, I resumed my jog, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. Soon, I approached the old wooden bridge that would lead me back towards home. As I reached the midpoint of the bridge, I heard footsteps. They weren't the rhythmic patter of a jogger, they were deliberate and heavy. My heart rate quickened, and I glanced back. It was the man from the clearing. He was walking towards me, maintaining the unsettling eye contact. There was something predatory in his gaze, like a cat tracking its prey. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a sprint. I didn't dare look back, but his footsteps grew louder, faster. I veered off the main trail, hoping the rugged terrain would slow him down. The forest had transformed. The once familiar trails now seemed alien, and shadows played tricks on my eyes. Light breath came in ragged gasps, but fear propelled me forward. Every rustle, every snapped twig sent a fresh wave of adrenaline pumping. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I stumbled upon a densely wooded area and, driven by sheer desperation, decided to hide. I crouched behind a fallen log, covering my mouth to muffle my breathing. The footsteps grew near, then paused. Silence, save for the distant hoot of an owl. Then, a voice, low and raspy, called out, "I just want to talk." The voice was chilling, drippy with malice. Minutes dragged on, but it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps receded. I waited, listening intently, ensuring he was far enough away. Then, using my phone's flashlight, I began my trek home, avoiding the trails and staying in the shadows. Emerging from the forest, the sight of my house was overwhelming. I sprinted the rest of the way, locking the door behind me. My parents, alerted by the commotion, listened in horror as I recounted the events. The police were called and they searched the trails, but the man was never found. For days, I was paralyzed with fear, jumping at the smallest of noises. The trails, once a place of solace, were now tainted with the memory of that evening. I couldn't shake off the image of the man, his cold eyes tracking my every move. The incident was the talk of the town. Neighbors installed security cameras, evening strolls were now done in groups, and parents kept a closer eye on their children. The community was on edge. 2 weeks later, a break came. An old shed deep in the forest, which had been abandoned for years, caught fire. The cause was arson. In the charred remains, the police found scraps of clothing, canned food, and disturbingly, pictures. Pictures of various residents, taken from a distance, their every move documented. Among them were photos of me captured during my mini jogs. The realization sent shivers down my spine. He had been watching, stalking, and I had been oblivious. Despite their best efforts, the police never identified the man. With no leads, the case went cold. The forest trails lost their charm for many after that. I left for college, the memories of that day gradually fading but never truly disappearing. The city, with its bright lights and constant hum, provided a welcome distraction. Years later, I returned home for a family reunion. The house, the backyard, and the trails all seemed smaller, less intimidating. Life after the reunion was different. I had returned to the city, my haven of skyscrapers and relentless noise, but Mia's words echoed in my mind, conjuring images of the man I'd hoped to forget. I felt an obligation to do something. If this man was still lurking, then other innocent residents were at risk, and my family, particularly Mia, were in danger. So I started to dig, determined to find a solution to this lingering threat. With some persuasion, I managed to get my hands on the initial police reports and the photographs found in the burn shed. The photos were disconcerting, candid shots of unsuspecting residents taken during their most private moments. Scanning through the stack, I noticed a pattern. Several of the photos were taken from a vantage point that I recognized, a cliff that overlooked a significant portion of the trail. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to revisit the trail. This time, I wasn't alone. I enlisted the help of a couple of friends from my self-defense class. We strategized, setting up camp at various points to monitor any suspicious activities. Days turned into nights and back into days. We saw hikers, joggers, families picnicking, but no man in a tattered brown jacket. Then, on the 5th night, as I was perched on the cliff with binoculars, I saw him. Just as before, he stood eerily still, watching the trail from the shadows, his piercing eyes scanning the area. Before he could disappear, I snapped a few photos of him and sent them to my friends stationed nearby. Within minutes, they were on the move, converging on his location. But he was fast. By the time they reached the spot, he was gone. However, we now had photographic evidence of his existence, and more importantly, of his face. We handed the photos to the police. Using facial recognition, they finally identified him. The man's name was Leonard Dobbs, a former resident of the town with a history of stalking and harassment. He had disappeared years ago, and his whereabouts have remained unknown until now. The police launched a manhunt, using our photos and the intel we provided. Within a week, they located his hideout, a small makeshift hut hidden deep within the forest, its interiors adorned with more disturbing photos, and tools that suggested suggested malicious intent. Leonard was apprehended in a neighboring town, attempting to flee. The community was notified, and relief washed over everyone. Thanks to collective efforts and determination, a lurking danger had been neutralized. Leah, now more curious than fearful, often questioned me about that week, eager to understand the details of our adventure. I, however, always steered the conversation away, wanting to shield her from the darker realities for just a bit longer. One thing was clear, though. My bond with the forest had changed forever. The trails, once a source of peace, now served as a constant reminder of vigilance. They had taught me that sometimes, beneath the beauty and calm, dangers lurk, unseen, waiting. To Leonard Dobbs, may you get the help you so desperately need, but more importantly, let's never meet again. The dead of night has a strange quality to it. The stillness, the shadows, and the eerie silence amplify the smallest of sounds. My story revolves around one such quiet night that quickly turned into the most unsettling experience of my life. I had moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of town for work. The building, although old, was surrounded by tall pine trees that often swayed melodiously with the wind. The neighbors were mostly older folks who went to bed early, so nights were generally quiet. The town itself had a low crime rate, and I felt relatively safe. One Thursday night, after finishing a series binge, I crawled into bed, ready to embrace sleep. Just as I was drifting off, my phone rang. The jarring ringtone in the dead of the night startled me. Checking the screen, I noticed an unfamiliar local number. It was past midnight, and I wasn't expecting any calls. Hesitant, I answered, "Hello." There was a brief silence, and then a man's voice, gravelly and cold, said, "You look peaceful when you sleep." The line went dead immediately after. The chill ran down my spine. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and all the windows were shut. How could someone possibly see me? I checked all the locks, turned on all the lights, and peeked through the blinds. The street below was deserted. Thinking it was perhaps a wrong number or a twisted prank, I tried to shake off the unease and went back to bed. But sleep was elusive. 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. This time the voice was almost a whisper. "Why did you turn on the lights?" Panic surged through me. Whoever this was, he was watching me. I dialed 911 immediately, explaining the situation. The operator was calm and advised me to stay on the line. She told me officers were on their way. As I waited, the phone rang 2 more times. Each time, the man made comments about my actions, about how I checked the front door, how I peered through the blinds, how I was sitting on the couch clutching my phone. It was as if he had eyes everywhere. The police arrived quickly. They searched the premises, checked every nook and corner around the building, and even scoured the nearby woods. But they found no one. They said it might have been someone with a twisted sense of humor, but they'd patrol the area just to be safe. Feeling a bit reassured but still on edge, I decided to crash at a friend's place for the night. I didn't want to be alone. The next day, I took stock of my apartment, trying to figure out how someone could have watched me. That's when I noticed something odd. A tiny, almost imperceptible, black dot on my bedroom ceiling. On closer inspection, it turned out to be a miniature camera. Horrified, I called the police again. They descended on my apartment and discovered a total of 5 hidden cameras in the bedroom, living room, bathroom, kitchen, and hallway. Each camera was actively transmitting. The subsequent investigation revealed that the cameras were being remotely accessed. With some tech magic, the police traced the feed to a house located a few streets away. When they raided the place, they found an elaborate setup of monitors, and more disturbingly, a treasure trove of footage, not just of me but of previous tenants as well. The occupant of the house, an unassuming man in his 50s named Edgar, was arrested. Turns out, he was the previous owner of my building. He had installed the cameras years ago and had been spying on various tenants, enjoying the perverse thrill of watching unsuspecting victims and, on occasion, making those chilling calls. The discovery shook me to my core. My home, my sanctuary, had been violated. Every moment, every intimate detail of my life had been observed by a stranger's prying eyes. The aftermath was a blur of police interviews, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights. I moved out of the apartment shortly after, needing a fresh start. The building was swept for more devices, and the current owner, just as horrified as the tenants, ramped up the security. Edgar was tried and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. It was discovered that he had a history of stalking and had been escalating his activities over the years. My life shifted dramatically after the Edgar incident. I no longer took things at face value. Friends and family noticed the change in me. I was more vigilant and often double-checked things. My apartment was now a fortress with the latest security systems in place. Months turned into years, and while the immediate anxiety of the situation faded, its undercurrent remained. I often caught myself scanning rooms for any unusual signs or watching strangers with more suspicion than warranted. Things took a brighter turn when I met Alex. Alex. He was understanding, kind, and had a calming presence. He became my anchor. We met through mutual friends, and after hearing my story, he made it his mission to make me feel safe again. We eventually moved in together, and with him by my side, my anxiety slowly ebbed away. One evening, as we were enjoying dinner at a quaint little restaurant, I noticed a man sitting at the bar, casting glances our way. His eyes, cold and detached, bored to mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was a look I'd come to recognize, one of obsession. As the night wore on, his gazes became more frequent, more lingering. I mentioned it to Alex, and he tried to dismiss it as paranoia. But when he finally took a good look at the man, even he felt an unsettling vibe. We decided to leave early. As we headed out, Alex whispered that the man was following us. We quickened our pace, desperately hailing a cab. Just when we thought we had lost him, he appeared right beside our cab at a traffic light, staring intently through the window. His message was clear: I can get to you whenever I want. Terrified, we went straight to the police. Unfortunately, they couldn't do much based on a single night's events. They asked us to keep a record of any further incidents, and de more. The man seemed to be everywhere. We'd find him at our favorite coffee shop, near Alex's office, even at the park where we walked our dog. He never approached us, never spoke, he just watched. We hired a private investigator, hoping to glean some insight into who he was and what he wanted. The results were shocking. The man, named Kevin, was Edgar's younger brother. He believed that my testimony was the sole reason for Edgar's imprisonment and had harbored a vendetta against me. Confrontation seemed inevitable. We decided to take matters into our own hands, arranging a meeting with Kevin at a public place. Alex and I, accompanied by a couple of friends, faced him. We demanded answers, hoping to end this torment once and for all. Kevin, in his twisted way, believed he was avenging his brother's unfair treatment. He thought that by instilling fear in me, he'd somehow balance the scales. It was heartbreaking and horrifying to see the depth of his delusion. Our pleas, our attempts to reason with him, seemed to fall on deaf ears. We left the meeting with a heavy heart, more fearful than before. Thankfully, our pi had recorded the entire conversation. We handed the evidence to the police, and coupled with our documented encounters, it was enough to get a restraining order against Kevin. With the law on our side, Kevin's appearances dwindled, but the experience was a scalding reminder of the scars I bore from my past encounter. With time, Alex and I moved cities, seeking a fresh start away from haunting memories. Now, years later, we live a peaceful life. We're cautious, but we've also found happiness, love, and a semblance of normalcy. The experience has taught us the value of trust, the strength of unity, and the importance of always being vigilant. To Kevin, lost in his vendetta and delusions, I genuinely hope you find peace. But for our sakes, let's never meet again. When I was 21, I moved into a small rental house in a fairly older neighborhood. The houses were close together, and most of my neighbors were elderly. It was a quiet, picturesque street, marred only by one thing: the house next to mine was vacant. The empty house was a looming, two-story structure. Its windows were dark and gave off a haunting vibe. The paint was peeling, the lawn was overgrown, and it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. About a month after I moved in, I noticed something odd. Late at night, I would hear faint noises coming from that house, sounds like footsteps, doors creaking, and even low murmurs. It was easy to dismiss it as the sounds an old house makes, or perhaps animals that had made their home there. One evening, as I was doing dishes, I looked out of my kitchen window, which directly faced the empty house's backyard. I froze. There, in the dim twilight, I saw a silhouette of a man. He seemed a bit dagon. I quickly turned off my lights and watched. After about 15 minutes, he stopped, looked around, and went back into the house. Disturbed, I decided to share my observations with Mrs. Thompson, an elderly lady who lived on the other side of the empty house. Over a cup of tea, she told me that the house had been vacant for almost a decade after the previous owner, an old widow, passed away. She had no family, and the house went to the state. Mrs. Thompson also mentioned that lately she'd noticed a man going in and out of the house, but she assumed he was from the bank or a realtor. Armed with this information, I contacted the local police. They did a quick search of the property but found nothing. They suggested it might have been a homeless person or kids playing a prank. They did, however, promise to increase patrols in the area. A week later, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crashing sound coming from the empty house. I peeked through my curtains and saw lights flashing inside the house, moving from room to room. Then the front door opened and a man stepped out. He was not alone, and with him was a young woman, her hands tied and a cloth gagging her mouth. She was struggling. Panicking, I dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes. Turns out, the man was a wanted felon, and he had been hiding out in the empty house, thinking it would be the perfect spot since the neighborhood was mostly elderly residents who kept to themselves. The girl he had with him was a local college student who had gone missing a week ago. The empty house, which once seemed like nothing more than a neighborhood eyesore, had been hiding a sinister secret. The authorities later discovered that the man had turned the basement of the house into a makeshift prison where he held the girl captive. The neighborhood was in shock. Many of my neighbors, especially the elderly ones, said they had often dismissed the noises from the house as mere creaks of an old structure or the sounds of stray animals. The realization that those noises were signs of something far more malicious happening right next door was deeply unsettling. As for me, I decided to move out. The memories of what transpired next door and the guilt of not realizing sooner were too much. Before I left, the community rallied together to petition the local government to do something about the empty house. The city eventually decided to tear it down, and in its place now stands a small community park. After the incident, I tried my best to return to a semblance of normalcy. I found a new place across town, in a bustling neighborhood where houses sat close and families were aplenty. It felt comforting, being surrounded by the sounds of kids playing in the streets and neighbors greeting each other. Every once in a while, when my mind drifted, memories of that night would flood back. I couldn't help but think of the young woman who had been trapped in that house. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned her name was Maya. She was undergoing therapy and was surrounded by a supportive family helping her navigate the aftermath of her ordeal. I mustered the courage and reached out to Maya. It felt right, like a loose end that needed tying. We met at a local coffee shop. As I walked in, I recognized her immediately. There she was, with the same dark hair and eyes filled with a resilience that spoke volumes. We exchanged an understanding nod and began our conversation. Maya was incredibly gracious. She thanked me for the role I played in her rescue. As we spoke, I realized we had a lot in common. Both of us were trying to rebuild our lives and find healing. Our meetups became regular, shifting from the coffee shop to walks in the park, then to movie nights. Over time, our bond strengthened. We found solace in each other's company, often talking about our dreams, aspirations, and the things that made us laugh. The shared trauma had brought us together, but our newfound friendship was built on mutual respect and understanding. One day, Maya suggested we visit the community park that now stood where the empty house once was. I hesitated initially, but eventually agreed. We sat there on a bench, looking at children playing and families picnicking. Maya turned to me, her eyes shimmering with tears. This park, she said, is a testament to the fact that darkness can be turned into light. We decided to do something constructive with our shared experience. With the help of some local organizations, we started a community outreach program aimed at educating neighborhoods about the importance of staying vigilant and being aware of their surroundings. We organized workshops, brought in experts to provide safety tips, and created a helpline for people to report suspicious activities. Our efforts garnered attention from local media. Stories were written about the transformation of the empty house, Maya's recovery, and our unique friendship. But most importantly, it helped spread the message of community safety and the importance of looking out for one another. Years passed, and life took us in different directions. Maya pursued her studies in psychology, wanting to help others the way she was helped. I moved to a different city for a job opportunity, but our friendship remained intact. Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful night, Maya and I would meet at the community park. We'd sit on our usual bench, reminiscing and catching up. It was our way of reclaiming the narrative, of reminding ourselves that though life could be unpredictable and at times terrifying, there's always a way to find hope and healing. In sharing our story, we hope to inspire others to always be aware, to trust their instincts, and to know that even in the darkest times, there's a possibility of light. It all began with a whim to travel the beautiful hiking trails of Oregon. As an avid hiker, the idea of spending my summer break on a solo backpacking trip was nothing short of thrilling. Most of my friends thought I was mad, but I always found solace in the arms of nature. My second week into the trip, I found myself heading towards the Whispery Pines Trail, a challenging 20-mile stretch famous for its breathtaking views. Checking my map and ensuring my supplies were in order, I began my hike early in the morning, hoping to set camp by a serene spot before nightfall. By evening, the woods grew dense, and the comforting sounds of chirping birds were replaced by eerie silences, occasionally broken by the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. I stumbled upon a small clearing near a stream and decided it was a good spot to camp. As the darkness enveloped the forest, I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and leaned back, enjoying the solitude. That's when I noticed a faint light in the distance, seemingly from another campfire. Must be another backpacker, I thought, not giving it much significance. A couple of hours later, just as I was about to crawl into my tent, I heard a voice calling out, "Ted, is someone there?" It sounded distressed, alarmed. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the voice. There, almost stumbling over the rough terrain, was a man, probably in his late 30s, looking disheveled and frightened. "Hey," he panted as he approached. "I got lost. My group was somewhere down south, and I wandered off. And I shared our campsite for the night. Something felt off. His story didn't quite align with the fact that I hadn't seen any signs of another group during my hike. Plus, his backpack looked almost empty, not something you'd expect from a backpacker. Sure, I replied cautiously, trying to mask my apprehension. You can pitch your tent right there. We sat by the fire, and I noticed him sneaking glances at me, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. Every question I asked about his journey was met with vague responses or flat-out deflection. By midnight, a thick fog rolled in, and visibility dropped drastically. My unwanted companion had pitched his tent and was seemingly asleep. I retired to my tent, ensuring my knife was within arm's reach. Hours later, a rustling sound woke me up. I strained my ears and realized it was coming from outside. The sound grew louder, closer. Suddenly, my tent's zipper began to inch open slowly. Heart pounding, I gripped my knife and waited. The silhouette of a hand appeared, reaching inside. In a split-second decision, I slashed at it. A scream pierced the night. "What the hell, man?" the stranger yelled, cradling his injured hand. "Don't come near me," I shouted back, exiting my tent with my flashlight and knife in hand. But the fog was dense, and all I could make out was the sound of his pained breathing. After what felt like hours, the first light of dawn began to pierce the fog. The eerie silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, several of them. I panicked, thinking the stranger had brought reinforcements. A voice boomed, "This is the police. Stay where you are." Relief washed over me. I later learned that the stranger was a fugitive on the run. A group of backpackers had spotted him acting suspiciously and informed the park rangers, who in turn contacted the police. They had been combing the forest the entire night. If it weren't for my instinctual slash in the dark, things might have ended very differently for me. The incident gave me a renewed appreciation for trusting my gut and the importance of safety precautions, even in the serene embrace of nature. The days following the incident were a whirlwind. I had given my statement to the police, and they had asked me to stay in the vicinity in case they needed any further information. The man I had encountered was wanted for a string of burglaries across state lines. They believed he'd been hiding in the forest to evade capture. My encounter with him had been pure bad luck. News spread fast. I was approached by local media outlets looking for the backpacker who faced off with the forest fugitive. Reluctantly, I shared my story, emphasizing the importance of being prepared and always listening to one's intuition. The attention was overwhelming, and I decided to lay low for a while. I booked a room in a nearby lodge. The owners, an elderly couple named Clara and George, had seen my story on the news and insisted on giving me a discount. They treated me like family, and their kindness was a welcome respite from the ordeal I had experienced. Clara, with her soft-spoken voice and stories of the past, had grown up in the area and knew the forest like the back of her hand. She'd tell tales of her adventures as a young girl, of lost travelers she'd helped, and of the ever-changing landscape of the woods. I found solace in her tales, and they helped distract me from the events that had unfolded. One evening, as we sat on the lodge's porch overlooking the dense canopy of trees, Clara said, "You know, nature has a way of teaching us lessons, but it also has a way of healing us." I pondered her words. She was right. Despite the scare, the forest still beckoned me. Its beauty, its mysteries, its challenges, they were all still there, waiting to be embraced. George, sensing my restlessness, offered to accompany me on a short hike the next day. We walked the familiar trails, and he pointed out landmarks, sharing snippets of history and personal anecdotes. The forest, with its towering trees and the melodies of birds, felt welcoming again. As the days turned into weeks, the unease from the incident began to fade. Clara and George became dear friends. They introduced me to many locals, and I became a part of their tight-knit community. What was supposed to be a brief respite became an extended stay. I eventually decided to settle down in the area, renting a small cabin not far from the lodge. I started offering guided hikes, emphasizing safety and preparedness. Clara and George's lodge became the starting point for many of these tours. The woods, once a place of fear, became my sanctuary again. Years passed, and life settled into a comfortable routine. Clara and George eventually passed on, leaving the lodge to me in their will. I continued their legacy, running the lodge and sharing tales of the forest's wonders and its occasional dangers with new generations of travelers. The incident with the fugitive became a distant memory, but the lessons it taught me remained. I always stressed to my guests the importance of being alert and aware, of respecting the woods, and of looking out for one another. Through it all, I realized that life's unexpected twists and turns could lead to profound transformations. From a solo backpacker seeking adventure to a guardian of the forest sharing its stories, my journey had come full circle. The woods, with their age-old wisdom, had shown me that even in our darkest moments, there's always a path leading to a new dawn. I've lived in a mid-sized city for most of my life, and while there are areas you want to avoid, especially after dark, I'd always felt pretty safe in my neighborhood. I had my routines, like my nightly jog after work, and everything was usually uneventful. That is until last summer. It was a balmy evening when I set out for my jog. I took my usual route, passing familiar houses, the corner deli, and making a turn at the small park. About 20 minutes into my run, I noticed a white van, seemingly nondescript, slowly driving by. The van itself wasn't particularly alarming, charming. What struck me was its pacing. It seemed to be matching my jogging speed, which I brushed off as coincidental at first. By the time I made it to the other side of the park, the van had passed by me 3 times. A shiver of unease ran down my spine. Trying to dismiss it as paranoia, I decided to take a shortcut through a pedestrian alley that would lead me straight back home. The alley was fairly well lit, and I'd taken this route countless times before. As I entered, I took a quick glance behind me, spotting the van parked a short distance away. Quickening my pace, I tried to reassure myself. It was probably just someone making a delivery or waiting for someone, but a nagging feeling told me otherwise. Suddenly, I heard the sliding door of a vehicle opening, followed by hushed whispers and footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me, and I decided to make a run for it. The footsteps behind me grew louder and faster. I could hear at least 2 distinct sets of footsteps, indicating there were multiple people chasing me. Gasping for breath, my mind raced. Where could I go? I remembered my friend Lisa's apartment was nearby. She lived on the ground floor of a building just 2 blocks away. If I could make it there, I might be safe. Summoning every ounce of strength, I dashed towards her building, darting between cars and jumping over low fences. The footsteps seemed to be lagging behind, but I didn't dare look back. Reaching Lisa's building, I banged frantically on her window. Within moments, she opened it, a look of shock on her face. I clambered in, and we quickly locked all doors and windows. Peeking out from behind the curtains, we saw 2 men in dark clothing standing near the alley entrance, looking around. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they retreated, disappearing into the night. Shaken, I thanked Lisa profusely for letting me in. I called the police and reported the incident, providing as much detail as I could. The officers were sympathetic but stated that without more information, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. After that night, I changed my jogging routine. No more evening runs. I joined a local gym and kept my outdoor activities to broad daylight, but the feeling of being watched, of being targeted, lingered. I became more alert, more cautious. Several weeks later, while heading home from work, I spotted the same white van parked near my apartment building. My heart raced. Were they watching me? Were they waiting for another opportunity? Determined not to be a victim, I discreetly took a photo of the van, including its license plate, and sent it to the police. I also shared it with friends and family, urging them to be cautious. A few days later, I received a call from Officer Martinez, one of the officers I had spoken to previously. They had traced the van to a rental agency and, after some digging, had linked it to a series of robberies and assaults in neighboring cities. The individuals involved were known to stalk potential victims, learning their routines before making their move. The information was chilling, and while I was relieved that the police were making progress, the reality of the danger I had been in began to sink in. The following month, with the combined efforts of local law enforcement agencies, the men were apprehended in a nearby town. Apparently, they had been involved in a string of crimes, targeting lone individuals in various cities. The ordeal was a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of life. I had been one step away from becoming another statistic, another victim, but my instincts, combined with a bit of luck, had saved me. In the months that followed, I organized neighborhood watch groups and personal safety workshops. Lisa, who had been my refuge that terrifying night, joined me in these efforts. Together, we emphasized the significance of community, of looking out for one another. If I had been in that situation and hadn't known Lisa lived nearby, or if she hadn't been home, the outcome could have been drastically different. Local news outlets picked up on our efforts, and soon, our story was being used as a cautionary tale to remind people to be vigilant. Parents started having more in-depth conversations with their children about safety, friends developed systems to check in on one another, and many individuals took basic self-defense courses. But even with the increased community efforts, I still had moments of unease. Nightmares of the chase often haunted my sleep, and the sound of footsteps behind me, even in broad daylight, made me jump. It was clear that the trauma ran deeper than I had initially realized, so I started seeing a therapist. It was during these sessions that I truly began to process the events of that night. I had harbored a guilt, a what-if scenario where I believed I could have done something differently, could have avoided the whole situation altogether. But my therapist helped me see that I had done the best I could with the information I had at the time. I wasn't to blame for the actions of those men. They had made their choices, and I had made mine, choices that saved my life. Life has a way of moving on, even after the most harrowing experiences. But some scars remain, reminding us of battles fought and lessons learned. My encounter with the men in the white van was a wake-up call, urging me to prioritize my safety and the safety of those around me. One evening, while walking my rescue dog, Max, I passed by the same alley where the chase had taken place. For a moment, memories flooded back, causing my heartbeat to quicken, but then Max, sensing my distress, nuzzled his head against my hand, grounding me in the present. I took a deep breath, reminding myself myself of how far I'd come. While the world might be filled with uncertainties, I had taken control of my narrative. I had turned a traumatic event into an opportunity to grow, to educate, and to strengthen my community. That's the thing about life's challenges. They can break us, or they can propel us to become better versions of ourselves. And while I wish I had never had that encounter, I am proud of the person it has allowed me to become. To those reading this, always trust your gut, look out for one another, and remember, no matter how dark the situation may seem, there's always a chance to turn things around, to find hope, and to rebuild. It won't be easy, but with resilience and community support, it is entirely possible. To the men in the white van, let's never meet again, but thank you for showing me the strength I never knew I had. I've always been a bibliophile. Every town I visited, I made a point to check out the local bookstore. During my college years, I spent a summer in a small coastal town interning at a marine lab. The town was a serene, quiet place, the kind where neighbors still borrowed sugar from one another. One lazy Saturday, I decided to venture to the town's only bookstore. It was a quaint, two-story building with the sweet aroma of old books filling the air. The moment I walked in, I felt a comforting stillness, accompanied by the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore. The elderly store owner gave me a kind nod from behind the counter, absorbed in his newspaper. I wandered through the narrow aisles, losing myself in the world of books. As time went on, I settled at a secluded corner with a pile of novels. Occasionally, I would hear footsteps or hushed conversations from other patrons, but I remained engrossed in my reading. It was when I was deeply engrossed in a novel that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the book's gripping plot. However, the sensation persisted. Glancing up, my eyes met those of a man standing a few aisles away. He was middle-aged, with unkempt hair and an ill-fitted brown jacket. Though he was pretending to scan the bookshelves, his eyes were firmly fixed on me. Feeling uneasy, I decided to shift my location, convincing myself that I was just being overly paranoid. I moved to the second floor, where there was a reading lounge overlooking the ocean. But not even 10 minutes later, I felt the weight of a gaze on me again. I wasn't surprised to find the same man, this time sitting on a couch across the room, a book on his lap, yet his attention solely on me. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I knew this wasn't mere coincidence. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to reveal that I was staying nearby. The last thing I wanted was this stranger following me home. Instead, I decided to confront him. I walked over, heart pounding, and asked, "Is there a reason you're watching me?" The man looked taken aback. I thought you looked familiar," he stammered, not meeting my gaze. "I don't believe we've met," I replied firmly. His continued gaze made my skin crawl. Just then, a couple entered the lounge, breaking the tense standoff. Seizing the moment, I quickly made my way downstairs and approached the store owner. I quietly explained the situation, and without hesitation, he offered to help. "We're about to close," he announced loudly, ringing a bell on the counter. "Please make your way to the checkout." I watched from behind a bookshelf as the man in the brown jacket reluctantly made his way to the exit, casting one last lingering glance in my direction. The owner, Mr. Thompson, kindly offered to drive me home, even though it was just a few blocks away. I gratefully accepted, not wanting to risk a run-in with the stranger. As we drove, Mr. Thompson told me about the man. His name was Edward, a local who had grown increasingly unpredictable over the years. There had been whispers about him following young women, but nothing had ever been proven. The police had been involved once, but with no concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I thanked Mr. Thompson profusely for his help. As I reached my front door, he said, "Always trust your instincts, young lady, and never be afraid to ask for help." The next few weeks went by without incident. I avoided the bookstore and made sure to always have someone accompany me whenever I went out. The incident had shaken me, but with the support of my new friends in the town, I slowly regained my confidence. Towards the end of my internship, a local news story sent shivers down my spine. Edward had been arrested. He was found in the basement of his home, surrounded by dozens of photos of various women from the town, all taken without their knowledge. Among the photos were several of me taken at the marine lab, the cafe, and chillingly right outside my residence. After that harrowing experience, I took a few months to gather myself. The trauma of what could have been haunted my nights, and I found it challenging to trust new faces, especially in unfamiliar places. Eventually, I went back to my college town to finish my studies. Surrounded by familiar faces and routines, I felt a semblance of normalcy returning. But as with all traumatic events, they sometimes follow you, even if just in your thoughts. To help cope, I joined a support group that focused on individuals who had faced stalking or had close encounters with potential predators. It was in this group that I met Lily, a vibrant woman a few years older than me who had endured a similar experience. She had been stalked by an ex-boyfriend for over a year before finally obtaining a restraining pecking order. Lily and I bonded over our shared trauma and soon became close friends. Our friendship became a source of strength, allowing us both to face our fears and anxieties head on. One evening, while sipping coffee in a local cafe, Lily shared an idea she'd been pondering. What if we turned our traumatic experiences into something positive? What if we started a program to educate young women about the signs of stalking and how to protect themselves? The idea resonated with me. We both knew that education and awareness could prevent others from facing what we had. With determination, we set out to create a program that would be integrated into the local colleges. We collaborated with local law enforcement, counselors, and even managed to get a few grants to help with the funding. Safe Steps was born, and we held workshops teaching students about the warning signs of stalking, the importance of listening to one's intuition, and practical steps to ensure personal safety. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Many attendees shared their stories, revealing how common such experiences were and how vital a resource like Safe Steps was. One particular session stands out in my memory. A young woman approached me after a workshop, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "I think I'm being followed." We immediately involved the campus police and connected her with resources to ensure her safety. Months turned into years, and Safe Steps grew beyond our wildest dreams. We expanded to other colleges and even high schools. The feeling of turning our trauma into a tool for empowerment was indescribable. Lily and I often reflected on our journey. From victims to advocates, we had come a long way. We had each other's backs and were determined to have the backs of countless others facing similar threats. Life moved on. I graduated, found a job, and even moved to a new city. But the mission of Safe Steps and the lessons from that small coastal town remained a significant part of my life. Every workshop, every shared story, and every person we helped reminded me of Mr. Thompson's words, "Always trust your instincts." I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to that gut feeling in the bookstore. It's a chilling thought, but it reaffirms the importance of intuition and the need for resources like Safe Steps. The world is full of uncertainties, and danger sometimes lurks where we least expect it. But with awareness, community support, and a bit of courage, we can navigate it safely, turning traumatic experiences into tales of resilience and hope. The old downtown library was my refuge during my undergraduate days. Tucked between newer, more modern structures, it had that ancient book smell, creaking wooden floors, and ornate iron wrought stairs that led to a second floor with rows upon rows of tall wooden bookshelves. My usual spot was a table near a window on the second floor. The spot was quiet, tucked away behind a large bookshelf, and bathed in soft sunlight. Studying there always felt peaceful. About 6 months into my routine, I began to notice a man who seemed to frequent the library as much as I did. He was in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in a beige trench coat with a trilby hat that he would hang on the coat rack at the entrance. At first, I paid him little mind. He would sit a few tables away from me, engrossed in large, dusty books. But as weeks went by, I began to notice him glancing in my direction more frequently. When our eyes met, he'd quickly look away. Initially, I brushed it off as coincidence, but the frequency of his glances grew, making me increasingly uncomfortable. One evening, as the library's closing time approached, I packed up my stuff and headed for the stairs. I could hear footsteps echoing behind me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the man in the trench coat following me. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Reaching the main floor, I decided to test if he was indeed following me. Instead of heading for the exit, I went to the restroom corridor. As expected, he pretended to browse a nearby shelf, occasionally peering towards the corridor, waiting. After several minutes, I emerged, and without making eye contact, briskly headed for the exit. The library's old main doors led directly outside, and as I pushed them open, I realized it was already dark. The closest bus stop was 3 blocks away. Taking a deep breath, I started walking. The streetlights provided some illumination, but the shadows between them were dark and vast. Footsteps echoed behind me. Too scared to look back, I picked up my pace, my heels clicking frantically against the pavement. 2 blocks later, I dared a glance backward. He was closer, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat, but the intent in his eyes unmistakable. Panic sudden. My bus stop was up ahead, but there was no bus in sight. Then, an idea struck. To my left was a small, usually busy Italian cafe. Hoping it was still open, I made a beeline for it. Pushing through its doors, I almost collapsed in relief. The place was bustling with customers. I quickly found a seat near a window and tried to calm my racing heart. A few minutes later, he appeared outside the cafe, scanning the inside. Our eyes met, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as if deciding against something, he slowly walked away. I stayed in the cafe for nearly an hour, even after my pasta arrived, barely touching the food. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, the cafe owner, an elderly Italian man, offered to have one of his waiters walk me to the bus stop. I gratefully accepted. The next day, I reported the incident to the library administration and gave a description of the man. They promised to keep an eye out, but without any tangible proof, there was little they could do. From that day on, my beloved second floor spot was abandoned. Instead, I opted to sit closer to the main entrance with more people around. I also changed my study hours, ensuring I left the library well before sunset. A few weeks later, the head librarian called me into her office. The man had been banned from the library. While they couldn't tie him directly to my incident, they had caught him on a surveillance camera, hiding a small camera underneath the study table. It was chilling to think about his intentions. Several months passed since the incident, and life resumed its usual rhythm. My memory of the trench coat man became a faded silhouette, replaced by the hustle of final exams and college applications. But occasionally, when dusk approached, and I found myself on the streets, the pulse in my temples would quicken, a residue of that harrowing encounter. One evening, while out with friends at a local diner, our laughter was interrupted by the news playing on the mounted TV. An older man had been arrested for stalking and attempting to kidnap a young woman. The police suspected there might be other victims and were urging people to come forward with any information. The still image they provided made my blood run cold. It was the trench coat man, looking as cold and haunting as I remembered. I felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief because he was behind bars, unable to harm anyone for now, and anger because I hadn't taken more aggressive action earlier, which might have prevented him from continuing his predatory behavior. The following week, I visited the local police station to provide a statement about my encounter with the man. The detective I spoke to was kind and understanding. He informed me that this individual had a history of troubling behavior, with some incidents dating back over a decade. More victims began coming forward, stories that painted a pattern: a man lurking in libraries, cafes, and parks, always watching, always waiting. Some accounts were eerily similar to mine, while others took even darker turns. With the collective accounts, the police built a robust case against him. The man was charged with several crimes, including stalking, attempted kidnapping, and invasion of privacy. Months later, as I packed my bags for graduate school in a different state, I came across a newspaper clipping about his trial and conviction. The man would spend the rest of his life in prison. Life moved on, but the lessons from that chapter stuck with me. I became an advocate for personal safety, organizing workshops in my graduate school and later in my community. It was my way of transforming a traumatic event into a force for positive change. I was also deeply touched by the outpouring of support from strangers. The Let's Not Meet community, where I had shared my story, had rallied around me. Their messages of support and hearing their own stories had been therapeutic. The world was filled with both light and shadows. My encounter with the trench coat man had introduced me to its darker corners, but by sharing my story, I also discovered its inherent goodness. In unity and community, and in the shared purpose of looking out for one another, I found hope and healing. That old downtown library, with its creaking floors and ancient books, had once been my sanctuary. Even though I never returned to my spot near the window on the second floor, the library remained a testament to my resilience. A reminder that even in our most vulnerable moments, strength can emerge. And while I would always carry the scar of that encounter, it would never define me. In the tapestry of life, some threads are darker than others, but they all weave together to create our unique story. Mine was one of survival, growth, and ultimately empowerment. The town I grew up in was quiet and uneventful, nestled amidst vast stretches of farmland. This made my choice to pursue a career in photography a bit ironic. What could one possibly capture in such a mundane setting? The answer was everything if you knew where to look. One summer evening, at 19, I decided to capture some night shots. The stillness of the night, with its inky black skies, speckled with stars, always mesmerized me. Equipped with my new DSLR and tripod, I set out around 10 p.m. An hour to my shoot, I was near an old, abandoned farmhouse that had always been a source of local legends. Some said it was haunted, while others spoke of it being the site of old prohibition transactions. However, most of these stories were embellished tales to scare youngsters. Positioning my camera to capture the skeletal silhouette of the farmhouse against the moonlit sky, I began adjusting my settings. Just as I was about to take a shot, I noticed a flicker in one of the farmhouse's broken windows. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, I refocused and clicked the shutter. As the flash illuminated the surroundings, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a face in the window, a man, woman with wild hair staring intently at me. I blinked, startled, my heart pounding. I looked again, but the window was empty. It's just your imagination, I whispered to myself, attributing it to the plethora of ghost stories I had heard. Shaking off the unease, I decided to move closer and take some shots inside the farmhouse. As I approached, the air grew colder, sending shivers down my spine. I told myself it was the draft and nothing more. Stepping inside, the dilapidated interior bore signs of age and decay. The wallpaper peeled off in chunks, the wooden floorboards creaked, and the air was thick with a musty odor. I set up my camera in what looked like the main hall, with a grand staircase serving as my focal point. Click, flash. When the flash cleared, I saw him, the man from the window, standing atop the staircase, a chilling grin on his face. Dropping my camera, I bolted out the front door without looking back. I sprinted through the fields, my breath ragged, the darkness amplifying every rustle and whisper of the wind. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where your feet feel heavy and the danger behind you inches closer and closer. When I reached the main road, I flagged down a passing car. The elderly driver, Mr. Perkins, a local I recognized, was shocked to see me in such a state. Between gasps, I relayed my encounter at the farmhouse. He drove me home, a grave expression on his face. Once we reached my house, he turned off the engine and sighed, "Son, what you saw wasn't a ghost, but something much more sinister." He shared a story from years ago when he was a young man. There was a recluse named Elijah who lived in that farmhouse. He was eccentric, always capturing animals and taking photographs of them. As years passed, rumors spread about his sanity deteriorating, progressing from animals to capturing and photographing wandering travelers. One day, he simply disappeared, leaving behind only whispers of his unsettling activities. The local police investigated after a few hikers went missing near the area, but they found nothing to directly implicate him. However, they discovered a hidden room filled with photographs, portraits of people, terror evident in their eyes, as if they were trapped or begging for release. No one knew what happened to those people or to Elijah. The story spread like wildfire among my friends and neighbors, with some being genuinely concerned, while others brushed it off, thinking I had let my imagination get the best of me. Soon, the tale reached the ears of local journalists, and I was approached for an interview. Although hesitant at first, I finally decided to share my story, hoping that it might deter others from venturing into potentially dangerous areas. The day after the article was published, a historian named Clara reached out to me. She said she had been researching the history of our town and the farmhouse in particular. She had uncovered a series of newspaper clippings and journal entries from the time Elijah was said to have lived there. Clara believed that there was more to the story than just myths and wanted to uncover the truth. We met at a local cafe where she spread out her findings on the table. Together, we pored over them, connecting the dots. The clippings revealed numerous missing person reports from the years Elijah lived in the farmhouse. Additionally, a diary entry from a local woman in that era detailed how her husband had ventured near the farmhouse and had never returned. She wrote of her grief and the eerie feeling she got whenever she passed by the property, convinced that her beloved was still there, somewhere. Armed with this newfound information, Clara and I decided to approach the police. We felt there was enough evidence to warrant a deeper investigation into the property, especially given my recent experience. The authorities were initially skeptical but agreed to inspect the farmhouse once more, this time with more thoroughness. The search was intense and lasted for days. And then, in the basement, behind a concealed wall, they made a grim discovery: a makeshift darkroom. Old photographs, some decayed with age, lined the walls. Each portrayed a terrified individual, their eyes reflecting sheer horror. Among the photographs were tools, ropes, and other instruments suggesting restraint and potential harm. The most haunting discovery was a series of journals, presumably written by Elijah himself. They detailed his descent into madness, his obsession with capturing the essence of fear in his photographs, and his belief that by doing so, he could gain immortality. DNA tests on some of the remains matched them with long-lost citizens of the town. The community was shaken to its core. A vigil was held for the victims, and the farmhouse was subsequently sealed off, with plans to demolish it. Clara and I formed a bond during this journey, connected by our shared mission to uncover the truth. She eventually published her research, shedding light on a dark chapter of our town's history. As for me, the experience gave my life a new direction. I became involved in community activities, advocating for safety and awareness. I also organized photography workshops, emphasizing the power of the medium but also teaching young enthusiasts about the ethics and responsibilities that come with it. The farmhouse's legend became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the past. And while the building itself was reduced to rubble, the memories lingered. Elijah's quest for immortality, in a way, was achieved, not through his disturbing photographs, but through the stories that passed from generation to generation, a testament to the evils man can commit. And though I had once wished to never meet him again, in the end, it was that chilling encounter that reshaped my life, making me more vigilant, grounded, and appreciative of the world around me. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and I landed an internship at a prominent tech company in the city. It was an exciting, bustling time. The company's building was located in an older, industrial part of town which had seen recent gentrification. Quaint coffee shops had sprouted alongside decades-old warehouses. There was one particular route I used to take from the subway to my office. It was through a narrow alleyway which saved me about 10 minutes every morning. Though it was slightly dim due to the tall buildings blocking sunlight, I never thought twice about it. One Wednesday morning, I noticed something unusual. A man in a business suit was standing in the alley, talking animatedly on his phone. This wouldn't have been odd except he was always there, every day, at the same time, in the same spot, and always talking on his phone. Initially, I brushed it off thinking he probably had regular calls and preferred to take them outside the office. 2 weeks into my noticing him, things took a strange turn. He started acknowledging me, a slight nod one day, a wave the next. By the end of the week, he'd greet me with a good morning or comment about the weather. I responded out of politeness. On one fateful day, as I was walking through the alley, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Hi, we always seem to run into each other, don't we? I'm David." Unnerved but not wanting to be rude, I introduced myself. We had a brief conversation, and he mentioned he worked for a startup at one of the neighboring buildings. It all seemed benign. We parted ways, and I felt silly for being on edge. However, the interactions began to escalate. Sometimes David would be waiting with a coffee, insisting I take it. Other times he'd walk with me to my building, talking about his startup. It was all very cordial, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Then one evening, after working late, I was walking to the subway when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was David, but he wasn't in his usual suit. He was wearing casual clothes and had a scruffy appearance, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His demeanor had shifted. He seemed frantic. "Where were you? I waited for you this morning, and you didn't pass by." His voice had an accusing tone. Taken aback, I stammered, I took a different route today." He looked me in the eyes, his gaze piercing. "I don't like when things change," he whispered. Terrified, I quickly excused myself and hurried to the subway. I was shaken. The next day, I told my colleagues about David. One of them, Mark, looked puzzled and said, "That's strange. I know almost everyone in the startups around here, but I've never heard of a David." Disturbed, I decided to avoid the alleyway and take the longer route. I also informed building security about my encounters. A week later, as I was leaving the office, one of the security personnel, Mr. Thompson, approached me. "You're the young lady who mentioned the man named David, right?" Nodding, I replied, "Yes, why?" He hesitated. "Well, we reviewed the security footage. There's no David entering or exiting any building nearby. In fact, the only time he appears is in the alley when you pass by. Then, he simply walks away, disappearing around the corner." I was stunned. Who was this man? Why was he so obsessed with me? My anxiety peaked, so I decided to involve the police. They took my statement and decided to stake out the alleyway. For days, David was nowhere in sight, and I started to feel like I'd overreacted. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice whispered, "I miss our morning chats." I hung up, panicked. The police traced the call to a disposable phone. Over the next days, I received multiple texts and calls, each more desperate and unnerving. The breaking point was a letter left at my office. Inside were photos of me going to my apartment, at a cafe with friends, even from my college days. The message read, "You can change your route, but you can't escape our connection." The police intensified their investigation and discovered David's real identity. His name was Eric, and he had a history of stalking. He'd become fixated on people he felt a connection with. There were restraining orders against him from 2 other women in different cities. They finally caught Eric lurking near my apartment one night. He had been watching me, tracking my movements for months, even before our alleyway encounters. After the arrest, life began to return to normal. Days turned into weeks and my heart would still race every time I passed the cafe or crossed that particular street on my way home. I would double check my locks, be wary of unknown numbers, and became increasingly more isolated, fearing David was around any corner. Work became my solace, a place I felt somewhat safe, especially with coworkers like Mark who were always ready to support me. One day, Mark approached me with an idea. "Have you ever considered self-defense classes?" My sister took some after a break-in at her apartment, said it changed her life, made her feel empowered. I hesitated. The idea of stepping out of my comfort zone was daunting. However, after some thought, I decided it was worth a try. Mark's sister, Lisa, recommended a place, and soon I found myself in a dojo with other women, some of whom had similar stories to share. As the weeks passed, I started feeling stronger. My posture changed, my steps became more confident, and I felt less vulnerable. It wasn't just about the physical techniques I learned, but the emotional healing the classes brought. It was a community where everyone supported one another. One evening, after an intense session, Lisa introduced me to Anna, a detective who attended classes to stay in shape. Anna and I hit it off, and over coffee, I shared my ordeal. She listened patiently, and then said something I hadn't expected. "Have you ever thought thought of turning your experience into something proactive, perhaps work with the police in raising awareness about stalking and personal safety. I mulled over Anna's words for days. The idea was tempting but terrifying. Would I be able to face an audience, reliving the memories, sharing the fear? But then I thought of the countless others who might be in the same situation, unsure of how to handle it. Maybe my story could help. With Anna's guidance, I began collaborating with the local police department. We organized community events, workshops, and school sessions. Anna shared safety tips and legal steps one could take, while I spoke of my experience, the signs, and the importance of seeking help. Mark was my pillar throughout. He'd attend every workshop, standing at the back, his presence a comforting reminder of the good people in the world. Over time, the workshops gained momentum. Other victims came forward, sharing their stories, and our initiative expanded. Local newspapers and TV channels covered our sessions, leading to a surge in community participation. One day, during a workshop at a college, a young woman approached me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Your story saved me," she whispered. "I realized my ex-boyfriend's behavior wasn't normal. Because of your workshop, I knew the steps to take. Thank you." It was moments like these that made everything worthwhile. David's shadow began to fade from my life. While the trauma didn't disappear overnight, channeling my energy into helping others acted as a balm. It was therapeutic, giving me purpose and direction. Years passed. Mark and I, bound by a deep friendship, began dating. Our bond, forged in adversity, was unbreakable. We eventually married and started a nonprofit dedicated to personal safety and awareness. The girl who had once been paralyzed by fear now stood in front of hundreds, turning her pain into a mission. David had intended to break me, to make me feel weak. Instead, he inadvertently pushed me onto a path of strength, resilience, and purpose. It started innocently enough. I began receiving a series of misdirected text messages from an unknown number. They'd often read, "Hey, it's Simon. Did you grab the stuff for Saturday's party?" Or, "Simon, you owe me for last night's dinner." The problem was, my name wasn't Simon. After the third message, I replied, "Wrong number. I'm not Simon." Almost instantly, the unknown number replied, "Oh, my bad. Sorry. I thought that would be the end of it." But then, I received another message from the same number, just curious, who am I texting? Against my better judgment, I answered, "My name's Alex. Nice to meet you, Alex. I'm Rebecca." We exchanged a few pleasantries and soon began chatting frequently. I learned Rebecca was in her late 20s and worked in advertising. Our conversations were light and fun, a pleasant distraction from my mundane work routine. But things took a strange turn about 2 weeks into our correspondence. I received a message from Rebecca late one evening. "Hey, Simon showed me a picture of you. You're cute. Why didn't you tell me you were so good looking?" My stomach dropped. I had never sent a photo to Rebecca, nor had I shared any personal information. "Rebecca, I never sent Simon any picture. I don't even know who Simon is." She replied, "LOL, don't be shy. Anyway, Simon says he knows you." Smile world. Hey, I was growing uneasy. "Rebecca, I have no clue who Simon is. Please ask him how he knows me." She took a while to respond. "He says you both went to college together. University of Portland." I was taken aback. "Yes, I did, but I can't recall any Simon from my time there." Our conversations dwindled after that. Her previously rapid-fire replies became sporadic, and I assumed she was probably embarrassed by the mix-up. But the eeriness of the situation stuck with me. One evening, as I was leaving work, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It was oddly familiar. It was there the next day, and the day after. The same pattern persisted. Every time I looked out of my office window or left the building, that black sedan was there, seemingly waiting. Paranoia began to set in. I decided to confront the driver. As I approached the vehicle, the windows rolled down, revealing none other than Simon. I recognized him immediately. We had indeed gone to college together, but weren't exactly friends. Simon was 2 years my senior and had an unsettling reputation for being intense and aggressive. The reason he wasn't on my radar was that I had tried my best to avoid him. Simon smirked. "Hey, Alex, remember me?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, from college. What are you doing here?" He chuckled. "Just wanted to catch up. You know, old times." His demeanor was off-putting, and my instincts were screaming at me to leave. "Look, Simon, I'm busy. Maybe some other time." He didn't respond, just watched me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I turned away and tried to put the unnerving encounter out of my mind. Days turned into weeks, but Simon's presence became even more palpable. He was either trailing me, parked near my apartment, or just happened to be at the same place as I was. It felt like I was losing my mind. One evening, I returned home to find my apartment ransacked. Nothing valuable was stolen, but personal items were shuffled, pictures were turned upside down, and my photo albums were scattered everywhere. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The police were involved, but there was no concrete evidence pointing to Simon. With with no signs of forced entry, they speculated I might have forgotten to lock up and someone took the opportunity to snoop. But deep down, I knew it was Simon. The turning point came one Friday night. I was staying late at work, and the building was nearly deserted. My phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was Rebecca. Simon's here, at your office. He's looking for you. My heart raced. How did Simon know I was still at work, and why was Rebecca within? I locked my office door and immediately called the police. As I waited, huddled behind my desk, I could hear footsteps echoing in the hallway outside, growing closer and closer. I held my breath, praying they'd pass by. Suddenly, my office door handle jiggled. Someone was trying to get in. The jiggling grew more aggressive, turning into violent shaking. Just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. Minutes felt like hours, but soon I heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief washed over me. The police apprehended Simon that night, right outside my building. They found lock-picking tools on him and chillingly pictures of me from college, from my daily life, from inside my apartment. Rebecca, it turned out, was an innocent party. She had run into Simon at a mutual event, and he recognized me from her chat when he borrowed her phone. It was he who had sent that warning message from her phone when she stepped away, likely as some twisted game. With the evidence against him, Simon was taken into custody and slapped with a restraining order. I later learned from mutual acquaintances that he had been dealing with a series of personal and mental health issues since college. His obsession with me was an unfortunate consequence of those struggles, though no one could explain why he had fixated on me specifically. Rebecca and I met face to face after the whole ordeal. She was genuinely apologetic, feeling responsible for inadvertently dragging me into this mess. We both attended a few therapy sessions together to cope with the trauma. Over time, we built a genuine friendship grounded in our shared experience. The next few months were a whirlwind of counseling, dealing with the legalities, and trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. While the physical reminders of Simon's obsession faded, the moved belongings, the rearranged photos, the psychological scars lingered. I'd jump at shadows, double and triple check my locks, and constantly look over my shoulder. However, life has a way of marching on. The incident, terrifying as it was, began to retreat into the annals of my memory. I moved apartments, switched jobs, and even took a sabbatical to travel for a few months. One evening, on the streets of Prague, I was admiring the beauty of Charles Bridge when a familiar voice greeted me. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to see a smiley Rebecca, camera in hand, capturing the sunset over the Vieltava River. It was an unexpected reunion, thousands of miles away from where our twisted tale had begun. We spent the evening reminiscing, catching up, and inevitably discussing the ordeal with Simon. It turned out that he was institutionalized, receiving the help he so desperately needed. Both Rebecca and I had grown from the experience. We learned about the fragility of the mind, the importance of vigilance, and the bonds that can form from shared trauma. As we parted ways, she said something that stayed with me. Life is a series of interwoven stories, some dark, some light, but it's up to us to decide which chapters define us. That night in Prague, standing on a bridge steeped in history and surrounded by tales of love, loss, and legends, I realized that every experience, no matter how dark, contributes to our story. And while we can't control every event that befalls us, we can control the narrative. My story with Simon was a chapter, a dark, harrowing chapter, but just a chapter nonetheless. The book would still be written, and I had many more stories to tell. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.